Hello, and welcome. It's late, and the world outside is quiet. You've come here to unwind, to let the day's worries drift away, to find some rest. Many of us find a strange comfort in the dark, a unique tranquility in stories from the shadows. It's a way to confront the unsettling from a place of safety, letting the narrative lull you into a state of deep relaxation. Tonight, as the gentle rain falls, we're going to journey into some of those shadows together. I have a few stories to share with you. True stories about ordinary lives that took extraordinary and disturbing turns. There's no need to be alarmed. Just let the sound of the rain wash over you and allow my voice to be your guide. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and just listen. Our first story takes us to a small, forgotten town where a secret lay buried for years, right under everyone's noses. My name is Julian Sinclair. By profession, I am an architect, a vocation that is less about art than it is about order. I trade in the tangible, the measurable. My world is one of blueprints and stress calculations, of load-bearing walls and zoning regulations. I believe in cause and effect, in the rational, predictable sequence of events that governs our physical world. A foundation is laid, walls are erected, a roof is set, each step a logical consequence of the one before it. There is a right way, a correct angle, a precise measurement for everything. It is a philosophy that has served me well, not just in my career, but in my life. I have always found comfort in the belief that the universe, at its core, is a well-designed structure, or at least, I used to. The man I am now, the one who checks every shadow and flinches at the whisper of his own name, would be unrecognizable to the Julian Sinclair of a few months ago. The blueprint of my reality has been irrevocably altered, its foundations fractured, by a series of encounters I still struggle to comprehend. It began, as most life-altering events do, on a day of utter banality. It was a Tuesday. The sky over the city was a flat, indifferent gray, and the air carried the familiar scent of asphalt and exhaust. I was walking back to my office on Fifth Avenue after a lunch meeting that had been both unproductive and unnecessarily long. My mind was occupied with the structural integrity of a proposed cantilevered balcony for the Henderson project, a puzzle of steel and glass that had been consuming my thoughts for weeks. It was in this state of professional preoccupation that a man stepped out from the narrow mouth of an alleyway, positioning himself directly in my path. He was a portrait of urban neglect. His frame was lost inside a grimy, oversized trench coat, the kind you see in old black and white films. His hair was a matted tangle of gray and black, and a scruffy beard obscured much of his face. But his eyes were a startling contradiction. They were not the clouded, vacant eyes of the drunks or the mentally lost who often haunted these side streets. They were sharp, intensely clear, and fixed upon me with an unnerving degree of focus. "Don't take the Franklin Bridge on your way home tonight, Mr. Sinclair," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, yet it carried a strange, resonant note of authority that cut through the city's din. I stopped dead, my thoughts of cantilevered balconies vanishing like smoke. A cold prickle of alarm traced its way up my spine. It wasn't just the warning, but the use of my name. I was not a public figure. My face wasn't on billboards or television. I was just another man in a suit in a city of millions. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "How do you know my name?" He offered no answer, his gaze unwavering. He simply ignored the question as if I hadn't spoken. "There's going to be a pileup," he continued, his tone flat, declarative. "A tanker truck jackknifes. You'll be stuck for hours, and you'll miss dinner. Take the lower road by the river. It will be clear." He took a half-step closer, and I could smell the stale scent of rain and earth on him. "And when your wife Kayla asks about the Henderson project, tell her you solved the zoning issue. It will save you an argument." She's been worrying about the finances. I stared at him, utterly speechless. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The mention of the bridge was one thing, a public fact, perhaps overheard, but Kayla, the Henderson project, the specific, private anxieties of my own home, it was impossible. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Had I seen him before? Was he a disgruntled former employee from a construction site? A private investigator hired for some reason I couldn't fathom? No, his appearance didn't fit. He looked like he had been sleeping in that alley for a decade. He offered a small, sad smile that did not reach his piercing eyes. It was a smile of profound weariness, of knowing things he wished he didn't. Then, without another word, he shuffled back into the deep shadows of the alley and was gone. For a long moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, the river of pedestrians parting around me. I was rattled, deeply so, but my mind, ever the architect, began constructing a defense. It was a bizarre coincidence, a lucky guess from a man who was clearly unwell, perhaps a gifted cold reader who had picked up on some subtle cue in my expression or posture. I forced a short, sharp laugh, though it sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I straightened my tie, adjusted my briefcase, and continued on to my office, determined to file the incident away in the cabinet of strange but meaningless city encounters. Yet, the man's words lingered like a stain. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I found myself hesitating. The Franklin Bridge was my standard route, the most direct path home. But his certainty, the sheer audacity of his claims, had planted a seed of doubt. A tanker truck jackknifes. It was so specific. Cursing myself for being a fool, for letting a madman dictate my actions, I turned the car onto the service ramp for the lower road. It was a longer, more winding route, but as I drove, a news bulletin crackled to life on the radio. A multi-car pileup, initiated by a jackknifed tanker truck, had closed all eastbound lanes of the Franklin Bridge. Traffic was backed up for miles. Estimated time to clear, 5 hours. A chill, colder and more profound than the autumn air, washed over me. It was one thing to be right about traffic. It was another to be right about the cause. When I arrived home, the house was filled with the warm, inviting aroma of roasted chicken. Kayla greeted me with a kiss, but I could see the familiar line of tension etched between her brows. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. We made small talk through dinner, but I could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air between us. Finally, as we were clearing the plates, she turned to me, her expression clouded with worry. "Julian, about the Henderson project. I was looking at the accounts today, and if we can't get that zoning variance..." The man's voice echoed in my head. "Tell her you solved the zoning issue. It will save you an argument." I took a breath. It was a lie. I was no closer to solving it than I had been that morning. But looking at my wife's anxious face, I made a choice. "It's handled," I said, forcing a confident smile. "I had a breakthrough this afternoon. The is as good as ours." The relief that flooded her face was instantaneous and absolute. The tension left her shoulders, and she let out a long sigh. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, pulling me into a hug. I was so worried. The rest of our evening was peaceful, intimate, and free of the financial dread that had been shadowing us for weeks. We talked, we laughed, and for the first time in a long time, the Henderson project wasn't a monster lurking in the corner of the room. But as I lay in bed that night, staring into the darkness, I wasn't thinking about zoning laws. I was thinking about the man with the knowing eyes, and a new, more terrifying monster began to take shape in my mind. The week that followed was a masterclass in self-deception. My rational mind, the architect of my identity, worked overtime to construct a fortress of logic around the events of that Tuesday. The man was a charlatan. The bridge closure was a lucky guess, a random shot in the dark that happened to hit its mark. His knowledge of Kayla and the Henderson project was gleaned from some overheard conversation, perhaps in a coffee shop or on the street. I replayed our encounter endlessly, searching for a flaw in his performance, a telltale sign of trickery. I built walls of reason, plastered them with probability, and reinforced them with the sheer unlikelihood of it all. Yet, despite these efforts, a creeping vine of dread was working its way through the foundations. I found myself altering my daily routine. On my way back from lunch, I would deliberately walk past the same alley, my heart performing a nervous staccato against my ribs. The narrow opening remained empty, a dark, silent mouth in the brick facade. I told myself I was proving he wasn't there, that it was a one-time event. But a more honest part of me knew I was looking for him. I needed to see him again, to confront him, to dismantle the mystery and reclaim my sense of order. The peace I had purchased with the lie to Kayla felt hollow. Every time she smiled at me, free from the weight of our financial worries, I felt a pang of guilt, not just for the deception, but for the terrifying secret I now harbored. The secret was that our lives, our peace, had been orchestrated by a disheveled stranger in a dirty coat. A week to the day after our first meeting, he was there again. He wasn't in the alley this time, but was standing by the revolving doors of my office building, as if waiting for me specifically. He was looking at a fixed point on the pavement, and for a moment, I considered turning around, running away, and never looking back. But my feet, acting of their own accord, carried me forward. As I approached, he lifted his head, and those same sharp, clear eyes locked onto mine. There was no greeting, no preamble. "The coffee mug on your desk," he said, his raspy voice cutting straight to the point. "The one your daughter, Lily, made for you in her pottery class. It's going to fall at precisely 2:17 p.m. Don't try to move it. It won't help." A cold dread, more potent than before, seeped into my bones. Lily. He knew my daughter's name. The fortress of logic I had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust. This was no longer a coincidence. This was something else entirely, something that defied the blueprints of my world. I felt a wave of nausea. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He gave that same sad, weary smile. "That doesn't matter," he said softly. "Just a messenger." He then turned and melded into the afternoon crowd, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I rode the elevator to my office in a daze. My assistant, Maria, gave me a concerned look as I walked past her desk without a word. I went straight to my own desk and stared at the mug. It was a lopsided, clay monstrosity, painted a garish blue with "Number 1 Dad" written in shaky handwriting. It was my most treasured possession. My first instinct was to snatch it up, to lock it away in a drawer, to protect it. But his words echoed in my head with the force of a command. "It won't help." A part of me, the architect, the man of reason, screamed that this was absurd. It was a mug. I had free will. I could simply pick it up. But another, newer part of me, a part born of fear and impossible knowledge, was terrified to defy the prophecy. I decided to test it. I would leave it. I would watch it. I would prove him wrong. I sat at my desk, unable to work, my eyes fixed on the ceramic cup. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Las 12:10. Las 12:12 at 2:16 p.m. The intercom on my phone buzzed. It was my boss, Mr. Abernathy, his voice impatient. "Sinclair, get in here. I need to talk to you about the revised schematics for the lobby." "Sir, can it wait just a minute?" I pleaded, my eyes darting between the clock and the mug. "Now, Sinclair," he barked. My body felt leaden. I wanted to refuse, to stay put, but the ingrained habit of professional obedience was too strong. I cast one last, desperate look at the mug and walked to his office. The conversation was pointless. A minor query he could have handled over the phone. It lasted less than 60 seconds. As he was dismissing me, I heard a distinct crash from the direction of my office. I ran back. The mug was on the floor, shattered into a dozen pieces. Maria was standing in my doorway, her hand over her mouth. "Mr. Sinclair, I don't know what happened," she stammered. "I was just on the phone. I heard the crash, and when I looked up, it was on the floor. No one went in your office." I just stared at the blue fragments, the broken pieces of number 1 Dad scattered across the polished floor. It hadn't been knocked over, it had simply fallen, as if the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended for the sole purpose of fulfilling his prediction. The horror of it was not just in the event itself, but in its triviality. A cosmic, inexplicable power had intervened in my life, not to move mountains, but to break a child's coffee mug. The sheer, pointless malevolence of it was suffocating. From that day on, the encounters became more frequent, a series of terrifying appointments I could neither predict nor avoid. He would appear, deliver a cryptic, unerringly accurate prophecy, and then vanish, leaving me to grapple with the fallout. He told me that a promising tech stock I'd invested in would plummet by 40% by the end of the week. I sold it, and it did. He warned me that our biggest client, a hotel conglomerate, would pull out of a multi-million-dollar contract on Friday. I tried to salvage it, working frantically, but on Friday afternoon, the call came. The deal was dead. He even told me which ceiling tile in the lobby would come loose and fall, a detail so mundane and specific that it was perhaps the most frightening of all. I watched maintenance replace it the next day. My life was no longer my own. The sense of agency I had always taken for granted was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty that I was merely an actor reading lines from a script I couldn't see. My belief in cause and effect was a joke. The world was not a well-designed structure. It was a chaotic, malevolent play, and I was its unwilling protagonist. I became a ghost in my own life. At work, I was distracted and paranoid. At home, I was distant, the weight of my secret a chasm between Kayla and me. How could I explain to her that our future was being dictated by a homeless prophet? That our successes and failures were not our own? The rational man, the architect, was gone. In his place was a man haunted by the future. A man who had seen the blueprint and realized, to his horror, that he was not the one who had drawn it. The last time I saw him was a month ago. The constant, low-grade terror I had been living with had settled into a kind of grim routine. I no longer searched for him, no longer sought confrontation. I simply waited for him to appear, to deliver his next soul-crushing verdict on my pre-written life. The encounter, when it came, was different. He was waiting for me not outside my office, but on the quiet residential street where I live, standing beneath the golden canopy of an autumn maple tree. He looked profoundly changed. The sharp, piercing quality of his eyes had dimmed, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it seemed to emanate from his very bones. He looked older, frailer, as if the act of bearing witness to the future was a physical burden that was slowly grinding him into dust. He didn't offer a prediction this time. There was no warning about stocks or clients, no trivial detail about my daily life. He simply looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something akin to pity in his gaze. When he spoke, his raspy voice was softer than I had ever heard it, almost a whisper against the rustling leaves. He asked a question. On October 14th, he said, his voice barely disturbing the quiet air, "When the car runs the red light, are you going to push her out of the way?" The question hung in the space between us, monstrous in its simplicity. He didn't specify who she was. He didn't have to. There was only one her that mattered. Only one person whose existence was the cornerstone of my own. He was talking about Kayla. He wasn't telling me what would happen. He was asking me what I would do, and then, without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked away. I watched him recede down the street, a hunched figure in a coat too big for him, until he turned a corner and was gone. I haven't seen him since. The month that followed was a unique form of hell. The previous predictions had been horrifying, but they had been about external events I was powerless to change. They had stripped me of my agency, turning me into a spectator of my own life. This was different. This was worse. He had given my agency back, but he had attached it to an impossible choice. He had handed me a gun in the final act of a play and asked me if I was going to fire it. Asterisk, asterisk, my architect's mind. The last vestige of the man I used to be went into overdrive. I analyzed the question from every angle. Was it a trick? A test? If I tried to avoid the situation, would fate conspire to make it happen anyway? Just as it had with the coffee mug. I thought about canceling our dinner reservations for the 14th. I thought about feigning illness, about taking Kayla away on a trip, about locking ourselves in the house and not leaving. But I remembered the futility of my defiance with Lily's mug. The universe, it seemed, did not appreciate having its script edited. Any attempt to circumvent the event would likely only ensure its occurrence in some other, perhaps more terrible, way. I was trapped. If I did nothing, let the event play out, as foretold, Kayla would be hit by the car. If I acted, if I pushed her out of the way, I would be the one in its path. The messenger had presented me with a blueprint for a tragedy, and my only role was to decide who the victim would be. The horror was no longer in knowing what was coming. It was in knowing that I had to choose. October 14th arrived on a wave of cold, clear air. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a mocking counterpoint to the storm raging inside me. Every moment of the day was charged with a dreadful significance. The way Kayla smiled at me over breakfast, the sound of her laughter as she talked, on the phone with her sister. Each mundane detail felt like a final, precious memory I was desperately trying to commit to permanence. I was a ghost at my own feast, watching the woman I loved, knowing that by the end of the night, one of us would be gone as we got ready for dinner. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were watching a film. I put on a suit, knotted my tie, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, his eyes hollow with a terror I could no longer conceal. Kayla came up behind me, beautiful in a simple black dress, and wrapped her arms around my waist. "You've been so quiet all day," she said softly, resting her cheek against my back. "Is everything okay?" I turned and held her, burying my face in her hair, inhaling her scent. "I love you," I whispered, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Never forget that." The walk to the restaurant was only a few blocks. With every step, the knot in my stomach tightened. We arrived at the final intersection. The restaurant was across the street, its warm lights a beacon of a life I might never reach. We stood on the corner, waiting for the signal. The traffic flowed past a river of steel and light. I scanned each car, my heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm. The white pedestrian sign lit up. "Walk." Kayla took my hand. "Come on," she said, stepping off the curb, and then I saw it. To my left, a dark sedan, moving too fast. The driver's face was illuminated by their phone, oblivious. It was exactly as I knew it would be. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. I could see every detail, the make of the car, the determined set of Kayla's stride as she stepped into its path, the red light glowing defiantly above the intersection. Asterisk. I didn't shout. I didn't hesitate. I acted. With all my strength, I shoved her forward, pushing her out of the car's trajectory and into the safety of the street beyond. Her cry of surprise was swallowed by the squeal of tires and the sickening, final crunch of metal against bone. The horror, I've come to understand, isn't in knowing what's coming. It isn't even in having to make an impossible choice. The true, lasting horror is this. Lying here, in this sterile white room, unable to move, I now know that the messenger was me. That weary, broken man with the knowing eyes was my own future. Trapped in a loop, forced to relive his warnings, forever carrying the burden of the choice I just made. And I know that one day, I will have to find a young architect on a Tuesday afternoon and tell him not to take the bridge, beginning the cycle all over again. The blueprint is complete. My role was never to design it, only to build my own prison. Asterisk. Asterisk. My name is Clara Dawson, and until 6 weeks ago, I believed my life was irrevocably, beautifully ordinary. It's a life many people strive for, the kind you see in carefully curated photographs online, except ours was real. My husband, Billy, is a man whose laughter can fill a room. A solid, dependable presence who works as an architect, building dreams for others while we were busy building our own. Our shared dream, the very heart of our world, is our son, also named Billy, though we call him Little Billy. At 2 years old, he is a whirlwind of boundless energy, chubby-cheeked smiles, and a vocabulary of charmingly mispronounced words. We live in a modest 2-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street, the kind of place where you know your neighbors by name, and the loudest sound on a weekday afternoon is the distant drone of a lawnmower. Our weekends were a sacred ritual of pancake breakfasts, trips to the park, and evenings spent curled up together on our worn-out leather sofa. Our life was a tapestry woven with simple, profound joys. The smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the sight of little Billy's tiny sneakers by the front door, the comfortable silence between my husband and me as we read in bed at night. It was a perfect, fragile snow globe of happiness. And then, without warning, something shook it. A dark reflection of myself slipped into the idyllic picture, and the glass began to crack. It started on a Sunday night, an evening no different from any other. I was tired from a long weekend of chasing a toddler, and I went to bed before Billy, who was finishing up some work emails downstairs. I have a peculiar habit when I sleep, a holdover from a childhood fear of monsters under the bed. I sleep on my stomach, with the thick duvet pulled completely over my head, creating a small, dark, and safe cocoon. It has always made me feel secure, impenetrable. That night, I drifted into the fuzzy space between wakefulness and sleep, vaguely aware of Billy finally coming into the room, the dip in the mattress as he lay down beside me. A few minutes passed in silence. I was just on the cusp of sleep when I heard him whisper, his voice strange and tight. "Why are you smiling?" The question was so odd, so out of place in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, that it pulled me back to full consciousness. I was under the covers, my face pressed into my pillow. He couldn't possibly see me. I lifted my head, the duvet falling away, and blinked in the dim light filtering through the window from the street lamp outside. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. He screamed. It wasn't a startled yelp or a shout of surprise. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure terror, the kind of scream that rips from a person's soul against their will. He scrambled backward on the bed, pushing himself against the headboard, his face a ghastly, ashen mask in the gloom. He was pointing, his hand trembling, at the empty space on the pillow right next to him. You were just there," he stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned over, and you were propped up on your elbow, right there, looking at me. The image he painted made the hair on my arms stand on end. He said he'd turned to kiss me goodnight and had found me staring at him. But it wasn't my normal, loving gaze. He described a wide, vacant, and utterly chilling smile, a grin that didn't reach the eyes, which he said were open and fixed on him with a glassy, doll-like emptiness. The figure, my perfect double, had simply sat there, smiling, that terrible smile in the dark. The moment the real me spoke from under the covers, he said. The image vanished into thin air. My heart was pounding, but I tried to be the voice of reason. We talked it out, our voices low so as not to wake our son in the next room. We concluded. It must have been a hypnagogic hallucination, a waking dream, a trick of a tired mind caught between two states of consciousness. We even managed a weak, shaky laugh about it. But as I lay in the dark, listening to Billy's breathing slowly return to normal, I couldn't shake the vivid, horrifying image he had described. I kept picturing myself, or something that looked like me, sitting there in the dark, just smiling. 2 days later, on Tuesday, the rational explanation began to fray. I'm a pharmacist and was working a late shift, not due home until after 10 p.m. Billy handled the evening routine alone, giving little Billy his bath, reading him a story, and putting him to bed. Around 8:30, after tucking our son into his crib, Billy was walking down the upstairs hallway. He told me later that he was just passing the entrance to our bedroom when he saw me walk past him, just for a second. He saw the back of my head, my familiar long brown hair swinging as I turned the corner into our room. He did an immediate double take. For a split second, his brain registered my presence before the logical part took over and screamed that it was impossible. I was at work, miles away. He called out my name, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent house. No response. Heart hammering against his ribs, he cautiously checked our bedroom. It was empty. He checked the bathroom, the guest room, even the closets. Every room was still and empty, except for our son's nursery, where little Billy was sleeping soundly, his small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. My phone rang a few minutes later. It was Billy, his voice strained and high-pitched with a panic he was trying desperately to control. He told me what he'd seen. I listened, a cold knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I told him he was overworked, that he was just tired, and his eyes were playing tricks on him. I was trying to reassure him, but I was also trying to reassure myself. The two incidents, so close together, felt like more than a coincidence. The unease followed me home and lingered. The next night, I came home from my shift to find Billy, not in our bed, but curled up on the couch with all the lights on. He looked exhausted, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He said he'd been hearing things all evening. Footsteps. My footsteps. He said he could hear the distinct, familiar sound of my gait pacing the upstairs hallway, a soft rhythmic tread moving from the kitchen-facing end of the hall to the bedrooms and back again. Then, just before I got home, he saw it again, the flash of my brown hair disappearing around the corner into our bedroom. He hadn't dared to go look this time. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell him he was letting his imagination run wild. But as I walked through the house, a new alien feeling washed over me. It felt like our home, but it also felt occupied. There was a strange energy, a sense of being an intruder in my own space. Later that night, I was in the nursery, rocking little Billy back to sleep after he'd woken with a small cry. As I sat there in the dim glow of the dinosaur nightlight, humming a soft tune, I got the distinct and prickling sensation of being watched. It was a physical feeling, like a pair of unseen eyes boring into the back of my neck. I slowly looked up towards the nursery door, which was closed. In the thin gap between the bottom of the door and the hardwood floor, I saw a shadow move. It slid from right to left, a dark, human-shaped silhouette blocking the light from the hallway for just a second before it was gone. I froze, my arms tightening around my son. My first thought was Billy. He must have gotten up. I waited a few minutes, my ears straining, but the house was silent. After gently placing little Billy back in his crib, I crept out and went to the living room. Billy was still on the couch, seemingly asleep. "Hey, hon," I whispered, nudging him. "Did you just get up and walk down the hall?" He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a weary dread. He shook his head slowly. "No, Clara, I haven't moved." His eyes locked onto mine, and he suddenly sat bolt upright, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and vindication. "See, you saw it, didn't you? I told you. It's not me. It's not my imagination. It's your doppelganger." Hearing him say the word out loud sent a shiver down my spine. A doppelganger, a phantom twin. It sounded like something from a ghost story, not something that happened in a quiet suburban home. but the evidence was piling up, and my rational mind was running out of places to hide. Something was in our house, something that looked exactly like me. The word doppelganger hung in the air between us, heavy and poisonous. For the first time since this nightmare began, Billy and I were completely in sync, united not by love or laughter, but by a shared bone-deep terror. The house, once our sanctuary, now felt like a cage we were trapped in with an unseen predator. Sleep became a luxury we could no longer afford. We spent the rest of that night huddled together on the couch, the television murmuring nonsense in the background, every light in the house blazing defiantly against the darkness. We spoke in hushed whispers, jumping at every creak of the old house settling, every rustle of leaves against the window pane. The feeling of being watched was no longer a fleeting sensation. It was a constant, oppressive weight on my shoulders. I kept glancing towards the upstairs hallway, half expecting to see a figure standing there, wearing my face and smiling that awful, vacant smile Billy had described. The next 2 days were a blur of forced normalcy and simmering panic. We moved through our lives like automatons, the fear a constant, bitter taste in the back of our throats. We took little Billy to the playground. We made spaghetti for dinner. We read him his bedtime stories. On the surface, we were the same happy family, but underneath, we were falling apart. Our conversations were stilted, our eyes constantly scanning the periphery. I found myself obsessively checking on little Billy, my heart seizing every time. I found his room empty, only to feel a flood of relief when I'd find him playing quietly in the living room. Billy began insisting on walking me to my car in the morning and waiting on the porch for me to come home at night. We were living on a knife's edge, and the strain was becoming unbearable. We were waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing, with a dreadful certainty, that it would. And it did, on Friday night. We had decided to try and reclaim some semblance of our old life. We put little Billy to bed, made a bowl of popcorn, and settled on the couch to watch a movie. For an hour, it almost worked. We lost ourselves in the film, the familiar comfort of our routine acting as a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. The house was quiet, peaceful even. Then, I heard it. It was a woman's voice, soft and impossibly sweet, drifting down from upstairs. It was singing a lullaby, the same one my own mother used to sing to me, the one I now sang to little Billy every night. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Billy and I froze, our eyes meeting over the popcorn bowl. "Is that ... the baby monitor?" he whispered, but we both knew it wasn't. We had stopped using the monitor months ago, once little Billy started sleeping through the night. The sound was too clear, too close. It was live, and it was coming from our son's room. My blood ran cold. The voice was a perfect imitation of my own. If I hadn't been sitting right there, I would have sworn it was me. We sat there, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical force holding us down. The singing continued for another verse, a gentle, loving melody that was twisted into something monstrous by its context. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with unspoken menace. It was broken by a soft thud from the nursery, followed by the pitter-patter of tiny, hesitant footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, little Billy appeared in the doorway of the living room, his favorite blue blanket clutched in one hand. He had climbed out of his crib. He had never, ever done that before. He stood there, rubbing his sleepy eyes, and looked directly at me, his little brow furrowed in confusion. "Mama, why you go away?" he asked, his small voice clear as a bell in the silent room. He pointed back towards the hallway. "You sing? You hear?" A chill colder than any winter's night washed over me, so intense it felt like ice water flooding my veins. He had seen it. He had been with it. This thing, this entity, hadn't just been pacing our halls. It had been in our son's room, standing over his crib, singing to him in my voice. I couldn't breathe. My protective instincts finally shattered the paralysis of fear. I leaped off the couch, scooped my son into my arms, and held him so tightly he squirmed in protest. I buried my face in his soft hair, inhaling his familiar little boy's smell, as if it were the only real thing left in the world. I carried him to the rocking chair in the corner of the living room, the one safe space I could think of, and sat there, rocking him back and forth, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I sat there, trying to soothe both him and myself, I saw them again, the shadows under the closed nursery door, at the top of the stairs. They were moving, shifting back and forth, as if pacing impatiently. It was there, just beyond the door, waiting. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even call out to Billy, who was still frozen on the couch, his face a mask of horror. I don't know how long I sat there, a prisoner in my own living room. Eventually, little Billy's breathing evened out, and he fell asleep in my arms. With trembling legs, I carried him back to his room. I checked every corner, under the crib, in the closet, before gently laying him down and pulling the blanket up to his chin. Then, taking a deep breath, I cracked the nursery door open and peered into the hallway. It was empty. The shadows were gone. The silence was absolute. The sheer emptiness of it was somehow more terrifying than seeing something there. The next day, we fled. There was no discussion, no debate. We packed a small overnight bag, bundled a confused little Billy into his car seat, and drove to my parents' house an hour away. The simple act of putting miles between us and our home felt like a desperate gasp for air. My parents' house was the embodiment of safety, a place of warm memories and unwavering love. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe we had been wrong. Maybe the stress had finally gotten to us, creating a shared delusion. Maybe in the bright, cheerful light of my childhood home, the phantoms would dissipate. That afternoon, my dad, a man who believes in logic and tangible reality above all else, suggested he and Billy take little Billy down to the basement. He still had the elaborate train set from my brother's childhood, and he was eager to show it to his grandson. I stayed upstairs in the kitchen with my mom, the comforting, familiar smell of her baking apple pie filling the air. For an hour, things felt normal. I could hear the distant rumble of the toy train and the happy squeals of my son. The knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. After a while, I decided to go down and join them. I walked down the creaky wooden stairs that led to the finished basement. My dad was on his knees by the train tracks. Billy was sitting on an old stool, and little Billy was watching the miniature locomotive circle the track, his face alight with wonder. As I stepped onto the concrete floor, my dad looked up and did a classic double take, a look of mild confusion on his face. "Wow, that was fast," he said with a chuckle. "How did you get over there so quickly?" He pointed to the other side of the room, near an old workbench. "You were just standing right there a second ago." The air left my lungs. I followed his finger. He was pointing at an empty space. I looked at my husband. Billy's face was grim, all the color drained from it. He slowly shook his head, his eyes locking with mine in shared abject horror. "The doppelganger strikes again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Clara, you were just standing over there. You were watching the train with Billy." I hadn't been. I had been upstairs in the kitchen with my mom the entire time. It wasn't a trick of the light in our dark hallway anymore. It wasn't a waking dream. It had followed us. 3 people, 3 sane and rational people, have now seen me where I wasn't. This thing, this shadow in my shape, is not tied to our house. It's tied to me. It's getting bolder, more brazen, and it's getting closer and closer to my son. And I have no idea what it is, or how to make it stop. The silence in my father's basement was a living thing, thick and suffocating. My dad's jovial expression had vanished, replaced by a deep, furrowed confusion, as he stared at the empty space by the workbench, then back at me. My husband's Whispered words. The doppelganger strikes again seemed to echo off the concrete walls. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the cheerful worry of the toy train as it continued its mindless circuit, a surreal soundtrack to our waking nightmare. My mother must have sensed the sudden shift in atmosphere, the abrupt cessation of laughter. Her footsteps creaked on the stairs, and she called down, "Is everything all right down there?" The spell was broken. I finally found my voice, a choked, ragged thing. "Dad, I was upstairs, with Mom, the whole time." He shook his head, as if trying to clear it. "No, that's not possible, Clara. I saw you. You were right there." He was a man who had spent 65 years believing only in what his eyes could see and his hands could touch. I could see the battle raging behind his eyes, the logical framework of his entire life straining against an impossible, terrifying truth. My mom reached the bottom of the stairs, her smile fading as she took in the scene. My father's bewildered face, Billy's ashen pallor, and the raw terror that I knew was written all over my own. "What is it? What's happened?" It all came tumbling out then, a frantic, disjointed narrative of smiling phantoms in the night, of footsteps in an empty hall, of a lullaby sung by a disembodied voice. We told them everything. I watched my father's face shift from disbelief to concern, and finally, to a grim, reluctant acceptance. My mother, however, reacted differently. She grew pale, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't look at me with disbelief. She looked at me with a dawning, ancestral fear. That night, my parents' home offered no sanctuary. We decided we couldn't go back to our house. Not yet, maybe not ever. But the knowledge that this thing had followed us meant that we hadn't escaped it. We had only brought the plague to a new home. My dad, ever the pragmatist, went into mode. He checked the carbon monoxide detectors. He talked about stress-induced psychosis. But after Billy and I both described the exact same vacant, horrifying smile, and my dad himself had seen the apparition with his own eyes, the rational explanations withered and died. We put little Billy to bed in my old childhood room, a space that had always felt like the safest place in the world. But now, its familiar floral wallpaper and collection of worn-out stuffed animals seemed sinister. I refused to leave his side. Billy and I took turns sitting in a chair by his bed, our eyes glued to the door, watching for shadows. Sleep was a distant memory. Every creak of the house was its footstep. Every whisper of the wind was my own voice, twisted into a mocking lullaby. The next few days were spent in a state of high-alert siege. My dad, clinging to the last vestiges of his logical world, ordered a set of high-definition security cameras and had them delivered overnight. We placed them throughout my parents' house, in the hallways, the living room, the basement, and one pointed directly at little Billy's crib. We huddled around the monitor like it was a campfire, searching for answers in the grainy, black and white footage. The cameras showed us nothing but an empty, silent house. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant, prickling pressure on our skin. Desperate, I turned to the only resource I had left, the internet. While Billy watched the camera feeds, I sat with my laptop, my fingers trembling as I typed in the word doppelganger. I fell down a rabbit hole of folklore, paranormal forums, and chilling personal anecdotes that went on for pages. The stories were terrifyingly similar to my own. They spoke of a spirit double, a harbinger of misfortune or death. Some legends claimed it was a malevolent entity that sought to replace its living counterpart, slowly inserting itself into their life until it could take over completely. The goal, according to several sources, was to sow confusion and terror, feeding off the negative energy until it was strong enough to make its final move. One forum post, written by a man whose sister had been plagued by a doppelganger, ended with a chilling sentence. "We thought it just wanted to scare her. We were wrong. It wanted her life. By the time we realized it was trying to get rid of her for good, it was too late. The words sent a jolt of pure ice through my heart. This thing wasn't just haunting me, it was replacing me. And its focus, its ultimate prize, was my son. It had sung him my lullaby. It had stood over his crib. It had watched him play with his grandfather. It was studying me, learning me, so it could become him. The activity began to change. It was no longer just passive sightings. It was becoming more interactive, more malicious. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making a sandwich for little Billy. He was in his high chair babbling happily. I turned my back for no more than 10 seconds to get a plate from the cupboard. When I turned back, the sandwich was gone. Not thrown on the floor, as a toddler might do, but vanished. The plate was empty. Little Billy looked at me and pointed to the doorway. "Mama, go," he said simply. Another time, Billy and I were in the living room, watching the security monitor. We saw my mother walk into the kitchen on the screen. A moment later, we heard her call my name from the top of the stairs. We looked up from the monitor, confused, and saw her standing there. When we looked back at the screen, the kitchen was empty. The timestamp on the footage confirmed it. She had appeared in 2 places at once. The entity was learning to mimic others. The breaking point came 3 nights after we arrived at my parents' house. We had all gathered in the living room, the camera monitor on the coffee table. Little Billy was on the floor, playing with a set of wooden blocks. Suddenly, he stopped. He looked up, his eyes focusing on the empty archway that led to the dining room. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Hi, Mama," he said, his voice full of love. My blood turned to ice. I was sitting on the floor right next to him. "No, sweetie," I said, my voice trembling as I tried to pull his attention back to me. "Mama's right here." He ignored me completely. He got to his feet and toddled towards the empty archway, his arms outstretched. "Up, Mama, up," he demanded, just as he always did to me. We all stared in horror at the empty space he was walking towards. On the security monitor, the feed from the living room camera showed him walking towards nothing. But then, the camera in the dining room, pointing back towards the living room, flickered. For a single, horrifying second, an image resolved out of the static. It was me, standing in the archway, my arms outstretched towards my son, a grotesque, painted-on smile plastered on my face. My eyes were black, empty pits. Billy let out a strangled cry. My dad shot to his feet. Before any of us could move, little Billy stopped, just inches from the archway. He dropped his arms, his smile faltering. He looked back at me, sitting frozen on the floor, and then back at the empty space. A look of profound confusion and fear crossed his face. He began to cry, a wail of pure terror that shattered the silence. I scrambled to him, snatching him up, but he fought against me, screaming and pointing at the archway. "Mama gone, scared, Mama." It had tried to touch him. It had tried to pick him up. This was no longer about sightings or sounds. This was an attempt at contact. An attempt to steal my child right in front of me. We know now that cameras can see it. We know it is focused solely on my son. It is no longer just a shadow wearing my face. It is an active, malevolent intelligence, and it has just declared its intentions. It wants to take my place, and it believes my son is already its own. My name is Josephine Wallace, though not a soul has called me that since I was old enough to protest. To everyone who matters, I am simply Joe. This distinction feels important now, a dividing line between the formal, documented person I am supposed to be, and the flesh and blood woman, currently living in a dead woman's house. The house, of course, belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Wallace. Her passing 3 months ago was a quiet affair, a gentle fading that mirrored the way the sun sets over the dense woods surrounding her property. In her will, She left me everything, the sprawling 10-acre property that felt more like a kingdom of solitude than a simple plot of land, and the house that stood at its heart. It was the house she had shared with my grandfather Robert for the better part of 50 years. He was a man forged in the fires of the local auto plant, a creature of the night shift. His life was a rhythm of humming machinery and the lonely drive home under a canopy of stars. Consequently, my grandmother spent countless nights as the sole guardian of this house, a silent sentinel watching over her sleeping children while the world outside slumbered. The thought of it used to fill me with a sense of profound respect for her strength. Now, it fills me with a quiet, creeping dread. The task of sorting through her life is monumental. Decades of existence are packed into every corner, a dense sediment of memories, treasures, and forgotten junk. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the scent of dried lavender, old paper, and the faint metallic temps of dust. Every box I open is a portal to another time, a child's drawing of a lopsided sun, signed in my father's clumsy, youthful scrawl. A stack of vinyl records, their sleeves worn soft at the edges, smelling of smoky jazz clubs and slow dances in the living room. A collection of chipped teacups, each one a silent witness to thousands of conversations, whispered secrets, and shared griefs. It is an archaeology of a life well lived, and I am its sole, reluctant excavator. For the first few weeks, I worked with a methodical, almost frantic energy, driven by a desire to impose order on the chaos. But the house resists. It has its own rhythms, its own personality. It groans at dusk as the temperature drops, a long, low sound like a sighing giant. Floorboards creak under my weight, each one a distinct note in a familiar, unsettling melody. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear what sounds like a soft thump from the attic, and I tell myself it's just a squirrel or a branch against the roof. I have to tell myself that. The isolation here is absolute. The main road is a distant rumor, a mile-long umbilical cord of gravel and dirt that connects this world to the other one. Out here, the nights are black and profound, and the silence is so complete it rings in your ears. It was on a Tuesday, during my 4th week here, that I found it. My project for the day was the grand darkwood china cabinet in the formal dining room. It was my grandmother's pride and joy. A piece of furniture that always seemed to stand apart from the comfortable, lived-in clutter of the rest of the house. It was reserved for the good china, the delicate, hand-painted plates and glasses that were only ever used on Christmas and Easter. It represented her sense of propriety, her belief in order and beauty. I worked my way through the shelves, carefully wrapping each fragile item in newspaper, my hands growing gray with dust. The back of the lowest shelf was dark, a cavern of shadows, my fingers, probing the depths, brushed against something small, cool, and cylindrical. It was out of place. It wasn't a teacup or a saucer. It was something else, tucked away deliberately, as if to be forgotten, or, perhaps, to be found only by someone looking for secrets. I drew it out into the weak afternoon light, filtering through the grimy window panes. It was a small glass bottle, no taller than my thumb, sealed with a brittle, aged cork. It looked like an old apothecary bottle, the kind that might have once held potent, dangerous liquids. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton that had yellowed to the color of old parchment, were 2 objects. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. They were small, off-white, with a faint, almost pearlescent sheen. They were irregularly shaped, hard-looking, and then a wave of cold nausea washed over me as my brain finally caught up. They were teeth, human teeth. One was a canine, long and slightly curved, its root a jagged, broken thing. The other was an incisor, flatter, with a chip on its cutting edge. My breath hitched. My heart began a frantic hammering rhythm against my ribs. This couldn't be right. This was my grandmother's house, my grandmother's china cabinet. She was a woman who baked apple pies, who knitted lopsided scarves for me every winter, whose hands were always gentle. She was not a person who kept human teeth in a bottle. My gaze fell upon a small rectangular piece of paper, faded and dog-eared, tied to the neck of the bottle with a length of rough twine. I fumbled with the knot, my fingers suddenly clumsy and slick with sweat. I finally worked it free and unfolded the paper. 2 words were written on it, penned in my grandmother's familiar, elegant cursive script that was at once so beautiful and now so horrifying. It read, "His teeth." I stared at the words, then at the bottle, then back at the words. The question slammed into my mind with physical force. Whose teeth? Who was he? The bottle felt impossibly heavy in my hand, a relic of some dark, unknown chapter of my family's history. A story of violence lay dormant in this tiny glass prison, and I had just become its keeper. I didn't put it back. I couldn't. I carried it, as if in a trance, to the living room and placed it on the center of the stone mantelpiece, above the cold, empty fireplace. It looked absurdly small, and yet utterly commanding. It was a focal point of wrongness in the quiet, dusty room. The 2 teeth sat there on their yellowed cotton bed, a gruesome trophy from a forgotten war. The house suddenly felt different. The familiar creaks and groans no longer sounded like the settling of old wood. They sounded like footsteps. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, and I was no longer just sorting through my grandmother's belongings. I was standing on the edge of a story I was terrified to learn. Sleep did not come that night. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, the image of those 2 teeth, stark and alien against the yellowed cotton, burned itself onto the inside of my eyelids. The bottle on the mantelpiece seemed to radiate, a cold energy that permeated the entire living room, a silent, malevolent hum that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. The house, my sanctuary of quiet grief, had transformed. It was no longer just a collection of old wood and memories. It was a crime scene, a place where a story of profound violence had unfolded, a story I knew nothing about. The question of, he echoed in the vast, empty spaces of my mind, a relentless, unanswerable drumbeat. I abandoned any pretense of sleep around 3 in the morning, the hour when shadows are at their longest and the world feels thin and fragile. A mission had taken root in my mind, supplanting the need for rest. I had to know. The methodical sorting of my grandmother's belongings was over. Now, I was a hunter, searching for the one thing that could explain the inexplicable. I needed context. I needed a name. I needed to understand how a woman like Eleanor Wallace, my gentle, loving grandmother, came to possess such a gruesome artifact. My search began with a frantic energy. I tore through old shoeboxes filled with faded photographs, scanning the backs for names or dates, looking for an unfamiliar face, a menacing glare. I sifted through stacks of letters, my eyes flying over cursive script, searching for any mention of an attack, a stranger, a fight. There was nothing, just the mundane, beautiful tapestry of a long life, news of births, condolences for losses, gossip about neighbors, plans for summer vacations. It was a life so normal, so utterly devoid of the kind of darkness the bottle represented, that it made its existence even more jarring. Defeated, I slumped onto the edge of my grandmother's bed, the floral pattern of the quilt a soft comfort against my trembling hands. My eyes scanned her room, a space I had kept largely untouched, a perfect time capsule of her final years. The silver-backed brush and comb set on her dresser, the well-worn Bible on her bedside table, and at the foot of the bed, a large, dark cedar chest. I had opened it once before, briefly. It was filled with linen's heavy quilts, starched tablecloths, and hand-embroidered pillowcases, all smelling sharply and cleanly of cedar. It seemed like the last place she would hide a dark secret. But now, driven by a desperate intuition, I went to it again. I lifted the heavy lid, the scent of cedar washing over me. I began to pull out the linens, one by one, stacking them carefully on the floor. And there, at the very bottom, beneath a thick wool blanket meant for the coldest of winter nights, I found them, a stack of 5 leather-bound books. They were journals, my grandmother's journals. Her name, Eleanor Wallace, was embossed in faded gold on the cover of each one. A lifetime of thoughts, fears, and dreams, locked away in cedar. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The answer had to be here. I carried the stack to the living room, my steps feeling heavy and momentous. I placed them on the coffee table and sat in her favorite armchair, a worn, floral print monstrosity that molded perfectly to my body. The little bottle on the mantelpiece seemed to watch me, its glass surface catching the dim light of the single lamp I had on. I picked up the journal from the middle of the stack, guessing by its worn spine that it might be from the right era. I opened it, the old pages whispering as they turned. Her script filled every page, a sea of elegant, looping letters. I scanned the dates, flipping through the years, until I found it. An entry dated almost 40 years ago, October 28, 1983. I took a deep breath, the dusty air of the house filling my lungs, and began to read. October 28, 1983. Robert is on midnights again this week. The house always feels so much larger when he's gone, the silence more profound. The children are asleep, thank heavens. David has a bit of a cough, but I gave him some honey and lemon, and he settled right down. I was watching Johnny Carson, trying to stay awake until I heard the car pull in, when there was a knock at the front door. It was nearly midnight. No one ever comes to the door this late. My heart flew into my throat. I turned the television down and crept to the door, peering through the peephole. I saw a man standing on the porch, thin and shivering, dressed in a light jacket entirely, unsuitable for the autumn chill. He looked distressed. I kept the chain on and opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. "Ma'am, I am so sorry to bother you," he said, his voice a pathetic whine. "My car? It's broken down about a half-mile up the road. I saw your light. I was wondering if I could just use your phone to call for a tow. My wife is waiting for me." His story was plausible. This road is lonely, and cars do break down. He looked harmless enough, more pathetic than threatening. But a woman alone at night learns a certain kind of caution. It's a lesson passed down, a primal instinct. "I'm not comfortable letting you in," I said, "but if you give me the number, I'll make the call for you." He looked relieved, almost grateful. He gave me the number for a local garage, and I left him on the porch while I went to the kitchen to use the phone. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have seen, was that he was not alone. His accomplice was there, pressed flat against the wall of the house, hiding in the deep shadows by the garage, waiting. A predator in the dark, patiently, stalking his prey, waiting for the click of the lock, the slide of the chain. But they hadn't counted on Father. He was still living in the little guest house then, just a stone's throw across the yard. He happened to be up, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, unable to sleep. His window looks out over our front yard. He saw the whole thing. He saw the 2 figures approach the house from the darkness of the woods. He saw one of them peel off and conceal himself, while the other came to the door, without a single moment of hesitation. My father, a man nearing 70, but still possessing the raw, wiry strength of a lifelong farmer, burst out of his own front door. He didn't shout. He didn't warn them. He ran. He crossed the yard with a speed that defied his age and tackled the hiding man, as he later described it, like a sack of hammers. I heard the commotion from the Kachuna strangled yell, the heavy, sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The man on the porch, his face a mask of shock and panic, turned to run, but it was too late for him to get away clean. Robert, my Robert, had just pulled into the driveway, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He saw the man fleeing, saw my father wrestling with the other one on the lawn, and he was out of that car in an instant. his hunting rifle in his hands. The man on the porch vanished into the blackness of the trees. Asterisk, asterisk, the accomplice was not so lucky. Father, with his hands like weathered shovels, held him pinned to the damp earth until Robert reached them. In the scuffle, the man had fought back wildly, and Father had been forced to subdue him. 2 of the man's teeth were knocked out, landing in the wet grass. When the police finally arrived and took the man away, I saw them glinting in the beam of a flashlight. In a moment of what I can only describe as grim, righteous victory, I went out and picked them up. They were my memento. Proof that they had come for us, and we had fought back. Proof that we had won. I put the journal down, my hands shaking. A profound shiver racked my body, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I looked up at the little bottle on the mantelpiece. The story was incredible, a piece of violent, triumphant family lore I'd never known. My grandmother, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, they were warriors. I felt a strange, fierce surge of pride mixed with a deep, unsettling unease. I went to bed that night with the story replaying in my mind, the images vivid and terrifying. The house no longer felt empty. It felt charged, haunted by the echoes of that night. I finally drifted off to sleep. The story of my family's victory, a strange and disturbing lullaby. It was around 2 a.m. when a floorboard creaked downstairs. I told myself it was just the old house settling. It was a familiar sound, one I'd heard 100 times. But this time, it felt different, intentional. Then I heard another sound, a soft, rhythmic, scraping noise at the front door. Scrape, 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 like a piece of metal being tested against the lock. I slipped out of bed, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I crept to the top of the stairs, my body rigid with a terror so pure it was paralyzing. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and thick with malice. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. Then, from the bottom of the stairs, a voice whispered up through the darkness. It was a dry, raspy voice, a sound that seemed to crawl up from a dusty grave, ancient with hatred. I've come back for my teeth. Asterisk, time ceased to exist. The world narrowed to the space between the top of the stairs where I stood, frozen, and the impenetrable darkness at the bottom where the voice had originated. It was a voice that didn't belong to the living world. It was dry and brittle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, yet it carried a weight, a resonance of decades spent in some cold, damp place. It was a voice fueled by a singular, ancient malice. I've come back for my teeth. The words didn't just hang in the air. They clung to it, thick and suffocating, like cobwebs. My mind, desperately trying to protect itself, screamed that it was a dream, a nightmare brought on by a gruesome story in an old, creaking house. I had to be asleep in my bed, tangled in my sheets, my subconscious painting this vivid, horrifying scene. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, I would see the familiar floral pattern of my wallpaper, feel the soft quilt beneath my fingers. But when I opened them, the darkness at the bottom of the stairs was still there, watchful and waiting. The cold hardwood floor was still beneath my bare feet. The terror was real. A violent rattling shattered the silence. The front doorknob was being shaken with ferocious intensity, the metal clanking against the wood. It was followed by a deep, groaning sound from the door itself, as if a great weight was being thrown against it. Thump, thump, thump. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a dream. This was physical. This was someone, or something, trying to break its way into my house. My breath came in ragged, silent gasps. My entire body was a single, taut nerve of fear. I had to move. The paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so potent it made my vision swim. Flee. My brain screamed a single command, but where? The windows in my bedroom were 20 feet above the hard, unforgiving ground. The only way out was downstairs, past the very thing that was trying to get in. I was trapped. My phone, my car keys, my only links to the outside world were all on the kitchen counter. An impossible distance away, my mind flashed back to the journal, to the image of my grandfather Robert emerging from his car with his hunting rifle. The rifle. My grandfather had been a hunter his entire life. He cleaned his guns with a religious reverence at the kitchen table. When he passed, my grandmother had kept them, locked away. She'd told me once, years ago, "You never know when you might need to protect yourself, Joe." Her voice, once a gentle reminder, was now a prophetic warning. The guns were in the master bedroom closet. Her bedroom, I had to get to them. Every movement was an agony of calculation. I lifted one foot, placing it down on the floorboard with infinite slowness, testing it for a creak. Silence. I took another step, my body hunched low, my ears straining to hear over the frantic pounding in my chest. The assault on the front door continued, a relentless, brutal rhythm that mercifully masked the small sounds of my own passage. I slipped into the master bedroom. The air in here was still, thick with the scent of her lavender sachets and old memories. It felt like a sacrilege to bring my terror into this peaceful space. The closet door opened with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers finding it and flicking it on. The closet was deep, filled with her dresses and his old suits, ghosts of people they used to be. At the very back, behind a row of winter coats, was the gun safe. It was a simple metal cabinet with a key lock. The key. Where would she keep the key? My eyes darted around the room, landing on the small, ornate jewelry box on her dresser. Of course, I hurried over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely lift the lid. There, nestled amongst pearl necklaces and silver earrings, was a small, brass key. My fingers were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the lock on the safe. It finally clicked open. Inside, resting on a green felt lining, were 2 shotguns and a hunting rifle. The rifle from the story. I reached for it, the cold, heavy steel, a shocking, solid reality in my hands. It felt like an anchor in a world that had come unmoored. There was a box of shells next to it. I grabbed it, my mind a blank slate, operating on pure, primal instinct. I didn't know if I could even remember how to load it, but holding it was enough. It was a piece of my grandfather's strength, a talisman against the dark, armed. I crept back out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The noise from the front door had stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse. It was a heavy, listening silence. I held my breath, my knuckles white on the stock of the rifle, and then I heard it. A sound that turned my blood to ice. A slow, dragging footstep on the bottom stair. Scray ape. Then another, ape. He was inside. He hadn't broken the door down. He had found another way. A window in the back. The cellar door. It didn't matter. The flimsy barrier of the front door had been a distraction. He was in the house. He was in the house with me. I backed away from the top of the stairs, pressing myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, trying to disappear. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. The footsteps continued their slow, inexorable ascent. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump. It was the sound of something broken, something that shouldn't be moving. A smell drifted up the stairwell, the smell of damp earth, of rot, of the grave. He reached the landing, the halfway point of the stairs, and stopped. I could see him now, a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the downstairs windows. He was tall, unnaturally so, and gaunt, his limbs long and thin like a spider's. He was stooped, his head hanging low. He wore what looked like the tattered remains of old clothes, dark and stiff with dirt. He was utterly still, but I could hear his breathing a dry, rattling wheeze, like air being forced through decaying lungs. He lifted his head slowly, and even in the deep shadows, I saw the glint of his eyes. They seemed to catch the faint light and hold it. Two cold, pale points of light in the darkness. The raspy voice slithered up the stairs again. No longer a whisper, but a guttural, demanding growl. "Give them to me." My mind was screaming. This was the man from the story, the accomplice. The man my great-grandfather had tackled to the ground 40 years ago. But it was impossible. He would be old now, a man in his 60s or 70s. This creature on the stairs was something else, something timeless and wrong, animated by a single, burning obsession that had outlasted reason, outlasted time, perhaps even outlasted death itself. My gaze flickered to the living room, to the mantelpiece where the small bottle sat. The source of all this horror. He had come back for his teeth. My fear was a living thing, a cold, coiling snake in my gut. But as I looked at the monstrous shape on the stairs, another feeling began to surface, pushing through the terror. It was a hot, fierce wave of anger. This thing had invaded my home. It had terrorized my grandmother. It had come back to terrorize me. This was my family's house. This was my fight now. My hands, slick with sweat, found their grip on the rifle. I raised it, the heavy barrel trembling in my grasp. I centered the sight on the dark mass of his chest. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice a choked, shaking whisper that was barely audible. The figure on the stairs let out a low, guttural chuckle, a sound of pure contempt. He took another step up. "My name is Althea Grant, and for the past 5 years, I've been living in a house that grief built. It's a sturdy old farmhouse, rooted deep in the black soil of farmland that has belonged to my family for 3 generations. But the foundation isn't stone, it's loss. The walls don't hold up a roof. They hold in a silence that is heavier than any timber. 5 years ago, my father, a man who was more oak tree than human, was felled by a heart attack. It was brutally sudden, a storm that appeared in a clear blue sky, and it left our family splintered and exposed. My father, John Grant, was the heart of this land. He was a man of routine and quiet strength, his presence as reliable as the sunrise. I remember the smell of his workshop, a mix of sawdust, oil, and pipe tobacco. I remember the sound of his heavy boots on the porch floorboards and the low, rumbling timbre of his voice as he talked to his crops, his cattle, or himself. He wasn't a man of many words when it came to affection, but his love was in his actions. It was in the solid fence posts he'd set, the perfectly tilled soil, and the way he'd always leave the porch light on for us, no matter how late we were. I believe I inherited his practicality, his connection to the earth. I understood the cycles of life and death, at least in the abstract way a farmer's daughter does. My younger sister, Cora, was different. She was his shadow, his echo. Where I saw a father, she saw a hero, a giant from a storybook. She had his fiery spirit, but none of his grounding. His death didn't just break her heart, it seemed to sever her anchor to the world. At the funeral, I stood stoic, holding my husband Mark's hand, my grief a tight, hot knot in my chest. Cora, however, was a ghost. She floated through the proceedings, her eyes vacant, her face a pale mask. She didn't cry, she just disappeared into herself. In the months that followed, that disappearance became more profound. She was a shell of the vibrant, sometimes frustratingly impulsive girl she used to be. The silence in the house was deafening, punctuated only by the creaks and groans of the old structure settling. It was Mark, my husband, who suggested we move in. He was an outsider to this world of soil and sorrow, a city boy with a kind heart, and a steady presence that I leaned on more than I ever admitted. "We can't leave her here alone, Althea," he'd said, his voice gentle. "This house, this land, it's too much for one person to bear, especially now." He was right. We packed up our small apartment in the city and moved back to my childhood home. The intention was to be a buffer for Cora, a support system to help her navigate the crushing weight of her grief. We thought our presence could fill the void my father had left. We were wrong. It was like trying to fill the Grand Canyon with a bucket of sand. The first year was a blur of awkward dinners and conversations that went nowhere. Cora would retreat to her room, the same room she'd had since she was a child, for hours on end. She lost weight. Dark circles became permanent fixtures under her eyes. Mark and I tried everything. We suggested therapy, a trip, a new hobby. Each suggestion was met with a hollow look or a flare of defensiveness that was so unlike her. Fine, she would insist, the words sounding rehearsed and brittle. We settled into a fragile routine. I took over managing the farm's finances, leasing out most of the fields to a neighbor. Mark, who worked remotely, became the de facto handyman, fixing leaky faucets and patching up the barn roof. Life went on, but it was a life lived in grayscale. The vibrant colors of our past had been leached away by loss. The strange occurrences began so subtly that I dismissed them as products of stress and an overactive imagination. A floorboard creaking in the upstairs hallway when we were all downstairs. A scent of my father's pipe tobacco, faint and fleeting, in his old study. I told myself it was just the house. Old houses make noises. Smells get trapped in the upholstery. These were the rational explanations I clung to. The first time it became undeniable was on a cold, moonless night about 2 years after we'd moved in. I was deep in sleep when Mark's hand clamped down on my arm, jolting me awake. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was sitting bolt upright, rigid as a statue, his eyes wide and fixed on our bedroom door. What is it?" I whispered, my voice thick with sleep. Listen," he breathed, his voice tight with a fear I had never heard from him before. I held my breath, straining my ears against the oppressive silence of the rural night. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant cry of a lone coyote. Then I heard it. It was faint, a low murmur coming from the direction of Cora's room, which was just down the hall. It was a man's voice. It was too low to make out any words, just a rhythmic, guttural cadence. "It's the TV," I mumbled, my mind desperately searching for a logical anchor. "She probably fell asleep with the TV on." "No," Mark whispered back, shaking his head slowly. "It's not the TV. Listen to the sound, Althea. The tone." I focused again, pushing past my sleepy denial. He was right. It didn't have the tinny, artificial quality of a television. It was deeper, more resonant. It sounded organic, and then a sliver of ice slid down my spine. In that strange, liminal state between sleep and wakefulness, a part of my brain that wasn't clouded by logic recognized the sound. It was a murmur I hadn't heard in years, but one that was etched into my soul. It sounded impossibly, terrifyingly, like my father. I threw the covers back, my drowsiness vanishing, replaced by a cold dread. "I'm going to check on her. Be careful," Mark said, his voice a strained whisper. I crept out of our room and down the short, shadowed hallway. The floorboards, which I knew so intimately, groaned under my bare feet. As I got closer to Cora's door, the sound stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was somehow more menacing. I pressed my ear against the cool wood of her door. Nothing, not a sound. Taking a deep breath, I turned the old brass knob and pushed the door open, just a crack. The room was bathed in the pale, silvery light of her digital alarm clock. Cora was asleep in her bed, her breathing deep and even. She was alone. The television was off. The window was shut and locked. There was no one there. There was nothing. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the nighttime air. I closed the door as quietly as I could and retreated to my own room, my mind racing. "Nothing," I told Mark as I slid back into bed. "She's fast asleep." It must have been the pipes, or the wind. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. I saw the look in his eyes. He didn't believe me, and in the deepest, most honest part of my soul, neither did I. That was the first night I truly felt it's a sense that we weren't just living with the memory of my father, we were living with him, and he was trying to speak. The morning after we first heard the voice was thick with unspoken words. Mark and I moved around the kitchen in a stilted ballet of avoidance, our conversation limited to the mundane. Do you want coffee? Did you let the dog out? We didn't mention the low, masculine murmur from Cora's room. We didn't mention that it sounded like my dead father. To speak of it would be to give it form, to let it out of the cage of the night and allow it to roam freely in the daylight. And so, we remained silent, the fear a third person at our breakfast table. That night, it happened again, and the night after that, it became a horrifying new part of our routine. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, Mark would stir, his body tensing, and I would wake up a second later, my own senses already on high alert. The murmuring would begin, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house. It was always the same, a cadence that felt like a frustrated attempt at speech, coming from behind Cora's closed door. Each time, one of us would creep down the hall, press an ear to the wood, and hear nothing but silence from within. We'd check the locks on the doors, the latches on the windows. Everything was always secure. Mark, ever the pragmatist, began to unravel. His city-bred sensibilities couldn't compute this. It's not possible, he'd whisper, pacing our bedroom floor after another sleepless night. Ghosts aren't real, Althea. Someone has to be getting in. Maybe there's a crawl space we don't know about. An old root cellar entrance. He spent a full Saturday inspecting every inch of the house's foundation, searching for a hidden entry point. He found nothing but cobwebs and old field stones. His fear began to curdle into a grim, protective paranoia. He was no longer afraid of a ghost. He was afraid of a man. Meanwhile, a strange thing happened. As the nights grew more terrifying for us, Cora began to bloom. After years of being a wilted, grayscale version of herself, color started to seep back into her cheeks. It started about 3 months after the nightly whispers began. She introduced us to her new boyfriend, Liam. He was, by all accounts, perfect. He was handsome in a clean-cut, trustworthy way, with a ready smile and a firm handshake. He listened intently when you spoke, worked as a junior architect in a nearby town, and seemed utterly smitten with my sister. He brought her flowers. He made her laugh, a sound I hadn't truly heard in 5 years. Mark and I were cautiously optimistic. We wanted to believe this was the cure. Maybe this new love was chasing away the shadows that had clung to her for so long. We invited Liam for dinner. He complimented my cooking, talked farming with a genuine curiosity, and treated Cora with a tenderness that made my heart ache with hope. He's a good guy, Mark said to me later as we did the dishes. A really good guy. Maybe this is what she needed to finally move on. We chose to believe it. We had to. It was a lifeline in a sea of encroaching dread. We even allowed ourselves to think that maybe, just maybe, the nightly noises were a strange prelude to this healing, a final guttural sigh of the house's grief before it let go. But the voice didn't stop. It grew more insistent. The murmurs felt less like a memory and more like an active warning. The feeling in the house began to change, too. The air grew heavy, static charged with a desperate energy. I started catching things in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the hallway, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the wall. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, the familiar, comforting scent of dill and vinegar filling the air as I prepared potato salad for dinner, just as my mother and grandmother had done in this very room. The radio was playing softly. Mark was at the hardware store, and Cora was out, presumably with Liam. I was alone. My back was to the hallway as I stood at the counter, chopping celery with a rhythmic thud. Althea. The voice was as clear and solid as if a person was standing right behind my shoulder. It wasn't a murmur. It wasn't a whisper, carried on a draft. It was a voice. His voice. My father's voice, imbued with an urgency that struck me like a physical blow. My hand froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. Every hair on my body stood on end. My blood turned to ice water. Something is wrong with Cora. I let out a scream that was torn from the deepest part of my soul, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. The knife clattered from my numb fingers onto the floor. I spun around, my heart exploding in my chest, fully expecting to see him standing there, a spectral figure in the sun-drenched hallway. But there was no one. The house was empty. The only sound was the cheerful pop song still playing. On the radio, a grotesque counterpoint to my horror. I scrambled backwards, stumbling against the refrigerator, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. It wasn't grief. It wasn't my imagination. It was a message. That evening, I saw his reflection. I was walking past his old bedroom, which we kept preserved as a sort of shrine, when I glanced at the glass of a framed photograph on the wall. For a split second, I saw him, not my own reflection, but his. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a flannel shirt, walking out of the bedroom doorway. Behind me, I whipped around. Nothing, just the empty, silent hall. I couldn't hold it in anymore. That night, Mark and I sat Cora down at the dining room table, the same table where we'd had so many strained, silent meals. The air was thick with tension. I told her everything. I spoke in a low, trembling voice, recounting the nightly whispers. Mark's frantic searches for an intruder, the voice in the kitchen, the reflection in the glass. "Dad is here, Cora," I said, my hands clasped tightly on the table to keep them from shaking. "I know how crazy that sounds, but he's here, and he's trying to tell us something. He's trying to tell us something is wrong with you. Please, if you're in any trouble, you have to tell us." I expected tears or confusion. Instead, I was met with a wall of fury. Her face, which had been so open and happy recently, contorted into a mask of rage I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "I cannot believe you too," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "He's gone. Dad is gone. Why can't you accept that? You're so wrapped up in your own grief that you're inventing ghosts. You're hearing things, seeing things, because you can't let him go." "Cora, this is real," Mark interjected, his voice firm but gentle. "We're worried about you." "Worried about me?" She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'm finally happy. I've met someone amazing, and I'm finally feeling like myself again, and you want to drag me back into this mausoleum of misery. You're not haunted by Dad. You're just haunted. Leave me out of it." She stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. She stormed off to a room and slammed the door, leaving Mark and me sitting in a stunned, wounded silence. The chasm between us had become a canyon. We were utterly alone in our fear. The haunting was no longer just a mystery. It was an alarm that only we could hear, and the one person it was meant for was refusing to listen. The house felt darker. That night, the silence, heavier, charged with a terrible, paternal desperation. My father was restless, and he was running out of time. Cora's slammed door was a declaration of war. It severed the last frayed thread of hope I'd been clinging to. In the ringing silence that followed her outburst, Mark and I just looked at each other across the wide expanse of the dining table. His face, usually a beacon of steady calm, was a landscape of defeat and fear. We were no longer just investigators in our own home. We were the enemy. The wedge driven between us and Cora was now a chasm, and across that gap, she was drifting further and further away. The days that followed were the worst yet. The house, which had felt heavy and desperate, now felt suffocating. A thick, oppressive blanket of resentment smothered every room. Cora was a phantom, slipping in and out of the house with barely a word, her eyes always averted. When she was home, she'd stay locked in her room, the silence from behind her door more unnerving than the nightly murmurs had ever been. Liam was no longer brought around for dinners. Her new, fragile happiness had been locked away from us, and we were left with only our terror. The nightly visitations didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. The low murmur was now laced with a palpable anguish, a sound of pure frustration that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It was the sound of a man trying to scream through a gag. Mark's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He was convinced Liam was the source. He has to be the one making the noise. Althea, he insisted one night, his voice ragged from lack of sleep. He's gaslighting her, making her think she's hearing things, making her dependent on him. He's a predator. He bought a set of high-tech motion-activated cameras, planning to place them outside Cora's window. But I knew that wasn't it. The voice we heard wasn't Liam's. It was my father's. Mark was looking for a man of flesh and blood, but I understood. We were dealing with a love that refused to be silenced by death. The cameras felt like a violation, a tool that would only drive Cora further away. We were at an impasse, trapped between a rational fear and a supernatural certainty. The breaking point arrived, as it had to. It was a Saturday. I was in the garden, my hands deep in the cool earth, trying to find some semblance of peace among the tomato vines. I saw Liam's car pull up the long gravel driveway. A few minutes later, Cora came out of the house, got into the passenger seat, and they drove away. For the next few hours, the house felt blessedly empty, quiet, but it was a hollow peace. That evening, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't wait for Mark's cameras, or for another spectral message I was too afraid to decipher. I had to reach my sister. Logic and fear had failed. All I had left was love. I waited until I heard her come home. The quiet click of the front door, the soft footsteps on the stairs. I gave her an hour, letting the house settle into its nightly rhythm. Then, taking a deep breath that did little to calm my racing heart, I walked to her room. I didn't knock. I turned the old brass knob and pushed the door open. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her coat, staring at the wall. She wasn't crying, but her entire body radiated a sorrow so profound it was almost visible. Her tough, angry exterior had crumbled away, leaving behind the lost, broken girl from our father's funeral. "I'm not here to fight," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. I closed the door behind me and sat on the old rocking chair in the corner, the one Dad had built for Mom when I was born. "I can't do this anymore, Cora. This silence between us, it's killing me." She didn't look at me, but she didn't tell me to leave. "I know you think Mark and I are crazy," I continued, the words spilling out. "And maybe we are. Maybe this house and all the grief in it has finally broken our minds. But all I know is that I lie awake every single night, terrified. And it's not the noises that scare me anymore. It's the thought of losing you." Tears began to well in my eyes, hot and unstoppable. "Dad loved you so much. You were his whole world. And all I can think is that if he were here, he would move heaven and earth to make sure you were safe. He would tear this world apart with his bare hands if he thought for 1 second someone was hurting you. And that's what this feels like. Cora, it feels like he's trying to tear his way back here because he's screaming, and we're the only ones who can hear him." I let out a choked sob. "Please, I don't care what it is. I don't care what you've done. I don't care if you hate me for asking. Just tell me you're okay. Look me in the eye and tell me you are safe and happy, and I will leave you alone forever. I will believe you." That was what finally broke her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. Her shoulders began to shake, and a terrible, ragged sob was torn from her chest. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 5 years, of pain and fear and shame pouring out all at once. I crossed the room in 2 strides, and wrapped my arms around her, holding my little sister as she wept into my shoulder. "He hurts me, Althea," she whispered, her voice so small I could barely hear it. "Liam, he hurts me." The confession came out in a torrent of broken sentences and shuddering breaths. It was him. It had always been him. The charming, perfect boyfriend was a monster. He hadn't been sneaking in through a crawl space. Cora had been letting him in through her window late at night, terrified of what he'd do if she refused. He was possessive, controlling, and his affection was a weapon. The tenderness we had seen was a performance. In private, he was cruel. He was sexually assaulting her, whispering threats, telling her it was her fault, that no one would ever believe her over him. Her happiness had been a desperate, exhausting act to keep him placated, to keep the monster from showing its face to us. She was too scared and too deeply ashamed to tell anyone. As she spoke, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The voice in her room wasn't the TV. It was him, his voice low and menacing as he whispered his poison into her ear. And the other voice, the low, guttural murmur that woke us up night after night, that was our father. He had done the only thing he could from beyond the grave. He couldn't lay a hand on Liam. He couldn't throw him out of the house or call the police, but he could listen. He could bear witness, and he could make enough noise to wake us up. He could use his own voice, a sound etched into the memory of the house itself, to sound an alarm that we couldn't ignore. He was doing what a father always does, protecting his child. The haunting wasn't the horror. The horror was what the haunting was trying to stop. That night, the house was finally, truly, silent. Mark called the police. Cora, wrapped in a blanket and my arms, told them everything. The next morning, Liam was arrested. The legal battle was long and painful, but we were there for her every step of the way. The healing process is even longer, and perhaps will never be truly complete, but the ghost is gone. My father's work is done. He can finally rest. The farmhouse no longer feels heavy with sorrow or fear. It feels like home again. Its foundation no longer loss, but a fierce, transcendent love. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, I think I can still smell the faint, comforting scent of his pipe tobacco on the breeze. It's not a haunting, it's a promise, a reminder that some bonds are stronger than death, and that a father's love is a porch light that never, ever burns out. My name is Kylie Ashworth. It has taken me over a year to find the courage to write this down, to give shape to the memories that still splinter the edges of my sleep. Some experiences are so profoundly wrong, so fundamentally alien to the world. You thought you knew, that they leave a permanent fracture in your perception of reality. They become a secret you carry, a cold weight in your soul that you can't share for fear of not being believed, or worse, for fear that speaking its name will somehow call it back. But the silence has become its own kind of haunting, and I've come to realize that the only way to reclaim any part of myself is to tell the truth of what happened to my friend Ben and me in Cannock Chase. Last year, we were 17. It was the suffocating height of the pandemic lockdowns, a period that now feels like a strange, feverish dream. Our world, once expanding, with the boundless possibilities of youth, had shrunk to the size of our laptop screens. Life was a monotonous loop of online classes, muted microphones, and the same four walls closing in a little more each day. We were crawling out of our skin, possessed by a restless energy that had nowhere to go. We were two teenagers in a pressure cooker of boredom and wasted youth, and something was bound to explode. It was Ben who first proposed the idea. We were on one of our government's ancient daily walks, tracing the same tired circuit around our housing estate for what felt like the 1000th time. Ben had always been the more impulsive of the two of us, the one with a glint in his eye that promised either a brilliant adventure or a spectacular disaster. "I can't do this anymore, Kai," he said, kicking a loose stone across the pavement. I feel like my ghost is going to wear a groove in this sidewalk. We have to do something. Something real. I knew exactly what he meant. I felt it too, a desperate, clawing need for a change of scenery, for an experience that wasn't curated, sanitized, or viewed through a screen. Like what? I asked, not expecting much. Break into the closed-down cinema. Have a rave. In the park with 2 people. He stopped and turned to me, his face lit with a conspiratorial grin. Illegal camping. In Cannock Chase, the name hung in the air between us. Cannock Chase, even for those of us who lived in Staffordshire. The name carried a certain weight. It wasn't just a forest, it was a place of stories. A sprawling, ancient woodland known for its dark beauty and even darker legends. We'd grown up with the tales whispered on playgrounds and told around campfires. Stories of werewolves stalking the heathland, of a grotesque pigmana, supposed product of a wartime experiment gone wrong, and, most famously, of the black-eyed child. We'd heard it all, and like most locals, we'd dismissed it as folklore. Spooky tales to frighten tourists and give the local area a bit of character. You're kidding, right? I said, but a thrill went through me, despite myself. We'd get caught. And besides, that place is creepy. That's the point, Ben insisted, his enthusiasm infectious. It's a proper adventure. No one will be there. We go deep in, find a secluded spot. Just for one night. Think about it, Kai. A real fire, stars, no parents, no Wi-Fi, just us against the wilderness. He made it sound so romantic, so liberating. The part of me that was suffocating under the weight of lockdown regulations was screaming yes. It was stupid, it was reckless, and it was exactly what we needed. The decision was made with the kind of thoughtless certainty that only possess. We were invincible, and the rules of the world, both natural and man-made, didn't apply to us. We were wrong. A few days later, we were in Ben's beat-up Ford Fiesta, rattling down the M6 with a cheap tent and 2 backpacks full of stolen snacks and lukewarm cans of cider. The further we got from the gray monotony of home, the more the weight lifted. We were giddy with the thrill of our transgression, blasting music with the windows down, feeling the wind whip through our hair. It felt like freedom. We entered the chase as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long dramatic shadows through the trees. We drove past the main car parks and visitor centers, heading for the Lestraden paths that led to a place called Birches Valley. Ben had researched it online, finding it to be one of the denser, more remote parts of the forest. Perfect for our illicit campsite. The paved road gave way to a gravel track, and then to a dirt path, barely wide enough for the car. The tresimos, pine and silver birch, closed in around us, their branches forming a dense canopy that dappled the light. After hiding the car, as best we could, behind a thicket of gorse, we shouldered our packs and began to walk. The air was different here. It was clean and sharp, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something ancient and wild. For the first hour, it was idyllic. We felt like seasoned explorers, laughing and pointing out trees and the occasional rabbit darting across our path. We eventually found what we deemed the perfect spot, a small, natural clearing, soft with moss and encircled by a ring of tall, silent pines. It felt secluded, protected, a secret place, just for us. Setting up the tent was a clumsy affair, filled with more laughter and frustration. As we worked, the sun bled through the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. But as the last sliver of light vanished below the horizon, a change came over the forest. The cheerful birdsong of the afternoon faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, expectant one. The kind of silence that feels like a held breath. We built a small, careful fire, the crackle of the flames a welcome intrusion into the stillness. We sat close, nursing our ciders, the firelight pushing back the encroaching darkness and casting our faces in a flickering glow. Ben, ever the showman, started recounting the legends of the chase in a low, theatrical whisper. They say the werewolves are the ghosts of soldiers from the old war camps that used to be here, he murmured, his eyes wide in the firelight. And the pigmen, well, no one wants to meet the pigmen. It's just stories, Ben, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The darkness beyond our little circle of light felt absolute, a solid wall of black. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt magnified. And then there's her, he continued, ignoring me, the black-eyed child. They say she wanders the trails at night, asking for help. People see her, they feel sorry for her, and they let her into their car or their home. And that's the last anyone ever hears from them. A shiver traced its way down my spine, cold and sharp. That's the dumbest one of all. Why would a ghost need help? I don't know, Ben said, his voice barely a whisper now. Maybe that's how she gets you. We sat in silence for a while after that, the mood broken. The fun of our rebellion was beginning to curdle into genuine unease. The forest no longer felt like a place of freedom. It felt like we were trespassing in a place that was not meant for us. The quiet deepened, pressing in on us until it was almost a physical force. It was an unnatural silence, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds of insects or distant animals. It was a vacuum. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire, plunging us into near total darkness, and scrambled into the tent, zipping it up tight, as if the thin layer of nylon could offer any real protection. We lay in our sleeping bags, side by side in the suffocating dark, every nerve ending on high alert. That's when we heard it. It started as a faint sound from outside the tent, a soft rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too light, too deliberate. They lacked the random cadence of a foraging creature. These were measured, careful steps, as if someone was slowly, purposefully circling our tent. Ben and I looked at each other in the gloom, our bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the crushing silence. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with anticipation. And then came the giggle. It was a high-pitched, childish sound, a little girl's giggle. But there was no joy in it. It was a thin, hollow sound that was utterly, terrifyingly out of place in the dead of night, deep within this ancient, silent wood. It cut through the darkness and seemed to echo not in the forest, but inside my own skull. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated wrongness. Asterisk, asterisk. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We were frozen, encased in a crystalline structure of pure terror. The giggle, a sound that should have signified innocence, had been twisted into a weapon. It hung in the airless space of the tent, a sharp, glittering shard of wrongness. My breath was trapped in my lungs, and the frantic beat of my heart felt loud enough to shake the ground. The silence that had been so heavy before was now a different beast entirely. It was charged, electric, waiting for the next horror. Outside, the deliberate footsteps had ceased, but their absence was no comfort. It was worse. It meant that whatever was out there was now standing still, listening, and waiting. In the faint moonlight that filtered through the tent's thin fabric, I could just make out the silhouette of Ben's face. His eyes were wide, fixed on the tent flap as if he could see through it. The cocksure bravado from earlier in the evening was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified teenager underneath. His breath was coming in short, shallow puffs. "Did you?" he started to whisper, his voice cracking. "Yes," I breathed back, the word barely audible. I didn't need him to finish the question. We both heard it. We both felt it. It wasn't a trick of the wind or a strange animal call. It was a conscious, intelligent sound, and it was directed at us. Time seemed to warp and stretch in the darkness. Every second felt like a minute. We lay there, two statues of fear, straining our ears for any other sound, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive, watchful silence of the chase. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a frantic, scrambling need for an explanation. It had to be a prank. Some local kids who'd seen our fire, trying to scare us. It had to be. My mind clung to that possibility like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood. But the giggle didn't sound like a prank. It was too cold, too empty. Ben started to move. He fumbled in the dark, his hands searching for something. I heard the click, and then a powerful beam of light cut through the gloom of the tent as he switched on his heavy-duty torch. The sudden brightness made me flinch. "What are you doing?" I hissed, my voice tight with panic. "I have to see," he whispered back, his voice resolute but trembling. "I can't just lie here. We need to know what it is." "No, Ben, don't," I pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Just leave it. Whatever it is, just let it go away." But it was too late. The impulsive spark was back in his eyes. Only this time, it wasn't fueled by adventure, but by a desperate need to confront the unknown. He shook off my hand, his movements clumsy with adrenaline. He crawled towards the front of the tent, the torch beam dancing erratically, illuminating patches of nylon and our scattered belongings in frantic, jerky movements. He reached the entrance, his hand hovering over the zipper for a heart-stopping moment. The sound of that zipper sliding open was like a gunshot in the silence, a final, irrevocable act. He pushed the flap aside and shone the beam out into the night. I scrambled up behind him, peering over his shoulder, my heart lodged in my throat. The torchlight cut a bright, conical tunnel through the absolute blackness, illuminating the trunks of the pine trees that surrounded our clearing. The air was misty, and the light caught the swirling particles of moisture, making it seem as if we were staring down a ghostly corridor. At first, there was nothing, just the silent, impassive trees and the damp, mossy ground. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. It was nothing. We imagined it. Then something moved. On the far edge of the light, a flicker of motion. I saw a figure dart from the cover of one massive pine trunk to another. It moved with a speed that was utterly unnatural, a fluid, instantaneous blur that my eyes could barely track. It wasn't the way a person runs. There was no sense of weight or effort. One moment it was there, a small, dark shape, and the next, it was gone, only to reappear behind another tree further away, as if it were blinking in and out of existence. It was like it could teleport. Ben would whisper to me later, and that was the only way to describe it. It was a glitch in reality, a skip in the film of the world. My blood ran cold. This was no prank. This was not some kid from the local village. The figure continued its impossible dance, flitting between the trees, a phantom in the torchlight. It would stop for a fraction of a second, peeking out from behind a trunk, a pale sliver of a face in the darkness, and then vanish again. It was playing with us, a terrifying game of hide-and-seek. I was paralyzed, locked in a state of pure, unthinking terror. The stories I'd read, the legends Ben had recounted by the fire, they weren't just stories, they were warnings. This was real, and it was happening to us. Finally, the figure stopped. It stepped out from behind the last tree and stood directly in front of us, poised just at the edge of the torch's effective range. The light wavered in Ben's unsteady hand, but I could see it clearly now. It was a little girl. She looked to be about 10 years old, wearing a simple, old-fashioned dress that seemed out of place for the time and the setting. Her hair was dark and matted, and she had her hands held up, covering her eyes. For a moment, all the supernatural terror was replaced by a jolt of human concern. Was she lost? Hurt? My brain, desperate for a rational explanation, seized on the possibility. "Are you okay?" I heard myself stammer, the words tumbling out, thin and shaky. My own voice sounded alien to me. "Were you screaming?" I added, my mind connecting the giggle to a cry for help. The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, with her hands pressed to her face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with dread. Then, very slowly, she dropped her hands. Ben's torch beam found her face, and the world fell away. Her eyes were completely, utterly black. There was no white, no iris, no pupil. Just two solid, glistening, soulless orbs that seemed to drink the light from the torch. They were pits of emptiness, voids of polished jet that reflected nothing of the world around them. They held no emotion, no thought, no life. They were simply there, a fundamental violation of nature. Seeing them felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. It was a sight so profoundly wrong that my mind buckled, unable to process what it was seeing. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Those eyes said everything. They spoke of an ancient coldness, of a hunger that had nothing to do with the physical world. The giggling started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the girl. It sounded like it was coming from all around us at once, from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. It was a disorienting, echoing chorus that seemed to vibrate in my bones and hurt my ears. A symphony of mocking, mirthless sound. The girl in front of us dipped her head slightly, a small, bird-like movement, as if she were adjusting her shoes or looking at something on the ground. Then, with the same impossible speed as before, she stood up straight, turned, and ran. She didn't just run away. She ran down a narrow path into a dense, dark thicket of trees where no path had been a moment before. She was there, and then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The echoing giggles faded, leaving us once again in the crushing, profound silence of the forest. The instant she vanished, the world rushed back in with a deafening roar. Ben scrambled backward with a choked cry, pulling the tent flap shut and fumbling frantically with the zipper. The sound of it sealing us in was small and pathetic against the vast, malevolent silence that had descended once more. He collapsed next to me, the torch falling from his hand and rolling across the floor, its beams spinning wildly before coming to rest on the tent's ceiling. We were plunged back into a suffocating, intimate darkness. For a long time, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The image of those eyes was burned onto the inside of my eyelids, a perfect, horrifying afterimage. Two pits of endless light, black. It was a sight that had fundamentally rewired my understanding of the world. Monsters were real, not the kind with claws and fangs, but something infinitely worse, a quiet, patient wrongness that wore the skin of a child. Ben was shaking, uncontrollably beside me, his teeth chattering. I could hear his ragged, desperate breaths. I reached out a trembling hand in the dark and found his. Our fingers locked together in a death grip, two terrified children huddled together against an ancient, incomprehensible evil. His hand was slick with cold sweat and felt as icy as mine. The shared contact was the only thing that kept me anchored to reality, the only proof that I hadn't fallen into some private, waking nightmare. "What was that?" he finally whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "Kylie, what the hell was that?" "I don't know," I breathed, and the honesty of it terrified me more than any lie would have. "The stories, Ben, the stories are real." The full weight of our stupidity crashed down on me. Our flippant disregard for the local legends, our arrogant belief that we were above such childish fears. We had walked into this place like it was our playground, and in our hubris, we had stumbled into something's territory, something that had been here long before us, and would be here long after we were gone. It wasn't just a haunting, it felt territorial. The footsteps, the giggle, the game of hide-and-seek-it was a display, a warning. Sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves outside the tent sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. My imagination, supercharged by terror, ran wild. I pictured her standing just outside the nylon wall, her black eyes fixed on our trembling silhouettes. I imagined her small hand reaching for the zipper, the sound of it slowly, deliberately being pulled down. The forest was no longer a neutral space. It was an active participant in our torment. The silence was her accomplice. The darkness was her cloak. We huddled together for hours, a silent vigil in the dark, waiting for the dawn as if it were a divine salvation. The night stretched into an eternity. At one point, I thought I heard the footsteps again, a soft, deliberate padding on the mossy ground, but they were fainter this time, more distant. Or maybe I had just imagined it. In that state of heightened fear, it was impossible to tell what was real and what was a phantom of my own terrified mind. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the first hint of morning began to penetrate. The oppressive darkness, a faint gray light started to filter through the tent fabric, slowly illuminating the cramped space. It wasn't a cheerful golden dawn. It was a weak, washed-out light, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over this place. But it was light nonetheless. It was hope. We waited until we could hear the first tentative chirps of birdsong, a sound so normal and wholesome it felt jarringly out of place. Around 7 a.m., with the gray morning light now fully established, we cautiously decided to emerge. Ben, moving with a stiff, fearful reluctance, unzipped the tent. The fresh morning air that filled the tent was cold and damp, but it felt like the sweetest, most life-affirming thing I had ever experienced. He pushed the flap aside and crawled out. I followed a second later, my body aching from hours of tense, sleepless fear. I stood up, stretching my cramped limbs, and that's when my stomach dropped. Arranged in a perfect, deliberate circle around our tent were small piles of stones. There were perhaps a dozen of them, each one a neat little cairn of 3 or 4 smooth, gray rocks, all spaced with an unnerving, almost mathematical precision. They hadn't been there when we set up camp. They formed a clear, undeniable perimeter around us, a boundary marker. It was a message. We know you are here. We have been watching you. A wave of nausea washed over me. I looked at Ben, and his face was a mask of pale, horrified disbelief. His eyes were wide as he slowly scanned the circle of stones. Then his gaze drifted upward, into the branches of the pine trees that encircled our clearing. "Kylie," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Look." I followed his gaze, and a fresh wave of terror, colder and sharper than anything before, pierced through me. Hanging from the lower branches of the trees, directly above the circle of stones, were strange stick formations. They were crudely woven from twigs and bound with what looked like blades of grass or strips of bark. They were twisted into bizarre, angular shapes, like nightmarish, malformed dream catchers, or the ritualistic totems of some forgotten, profane religion. They swayed gently in the morning breeze, a silent, menacing mobile of madness. That was the final straw. The sight of that deliberate, ritualistic display broke something inside us. This wasn't just a random haunting. This was intelligent. It was methodical. It was a claim. We didn't speak. There were no words for what we were feeling. We moved, with a frantic, terrified energy, a shared instinct for survival taking over. We tore down the tent, not bothering to fold it, just stuffing the nylon canvas into its bag. We shoved our sleeping bags, our empty cider cans, and our scattered belongings into our backpacks with clumsy, shaking hands. Every second we spent in that clearing felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those black eyes were peering at us from the dense shadows between the trees. Finally, we were packed. We shouldered our bags and, without a backward glance at the circle of stones and the hanging effigies, we started the hike back to the car. Ben estimated it was about a 15-minute walk, but it felt like 100 miles. We didn't walk. We half-rum, stumbling over roots and rocks, our backpacks bouncing painfully against our spines. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful and inviting just the day before, now felt like a living, breathing entity that was actively hostile to our presence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every tree seemed to watch us pass. We were perhaps halfway to the car, crashing through a patch of ferns, when a primal instinct made me glance over my shoulder. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I heard something, or maybe I just felt it, a cold spot in the air, a shift in the atmosphere, and there she was. She was standing about 50 yards behind us, partially hidden behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree. The morning mist swirled around her feet, making her seem ethereal and unreal. It was the same girl, the same old-fashioned dress, the same dark, matted hair. She wasn't moving. She was just watching us. Even from that distance, I felt the weight of her gaze. I couldn't see her eyes, but I knew they were black. I knew they were fixed on us. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't chasing us. She was just a silent, knowing presence in the morning mist, a final, chilling reminder that we had trespassed in her world, and that we would never, ever truly be free of it. My name is Sylvia Nithercat. I was only 2 years old in the winter of 1945, so my memories of that night are not my own. They cannot be. A child's mind is not built to hold such horrors. Instead, my memory is a phantom, a construct built from the fragments left behind by others. It is a patchwork quilt stitched together with the silken thread of my mother's unending grief, the brittle whispers of my surviving siblings, and the yellowed, fragile newspaper clippings she kept, tucked away in a shoebox until the day she died. The story I carry is not one I lived, but one that has lived inside me. It is the story of the night I lost 5 of my brothers and sisters, the night our family was burned to the ground, leaving behind only questions and ash. We lived in a sprawling, 2-story timber house just outside Fayetteville, West Virginia. It was a house built with confidence, much like my father, George. An Italian immigrant, he was a man carved from a different stone than the local populace. He was ambitious, industrious, and, most unforgivably, in the eyes of some, successful. He held strong opinions and was never afraid to voice them, a trait that earned him respect in some quarters and a quiet, simmering resentment in others. In the small, tightly knit communities of Appalachia, standing out was a dangerous business. My father, with his thriving trucking company and his refusal to be anything but himself, stood out like a beacon. We just never knew if it was a beacon that guided or a beacon that warned. That Christmas Eve, the house was thrumming with a life it would never know again. The air was thick with the scent of pine from the tree in the parlor and the rich aroma of the Italian pastries my mother, Jenny, had been baking for days. It was a symphony of warmth and anticipation. My older sister, Marion, then 17, had come home from her job at the dime store, bearing gifts for the younger children. I can picture her face aglow in the lamplight, presenting the treasures. Dolls with painted-on smiles for Martha, who at 12 was teetering on the precipice between childhood and womanhood. For Jenny, 8, a book of fairy tales. And for little Betty, just 5, a soft-bodied baby doll she immediately clutched to her chest. My brothers, Morris, 14, and Louis, 9, were buzzing with a rare privilege. They had been allowed to stay up late, a reward for their hard work on the farm. They were good boys, strong and capable. The deal was that they would handle the evening chores, feeding the chickens and milking the cows before finally turning in. I can almost hear their boisterous negotiations with my father, their promises echoing in the warm kitchen, a sound so ordinary it has become sacred in its absence. The older boys, John, 23, and George Jr., 21, were home from the war, their presence a comforting weight in the house. They were men now, their laughter deeper, their shoulders broader. But that night, they were just sons, home for Christmas. My mother put me to bed around 10 o'clock. The last thing I was told I remembered was the soft scratch of her wool sweater against my cheek and the low murmur of her voice. A gentle lullaby against the backdrop of a house full of life. The first tear in the fabric of that perfect night came at midnight. The telephone, a black, hulking thing on the wall in my father's office, shattered the quiet with its shrill, insistent ring. My mother, roused from a light sleep, answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, slurred and unfamiliar. She asked for a name my mother had never heard, a name that felt alien in our home. In the background, a strange cacophony of sounds bled through the receiver, the distinct clinking of glasses, raucous laughter, a party in full swing somewhere out in the cold, dark night. My mother, patient but unnerved, explained that she must have the wrong number. The woman on the other end didn't apologize. She just let out what my mother would forever describe as a weird laugh, a sound that was not born of joy, but of something mocking and cruel. Then, the line went dead. My mother hung up the phone, a seed of unease planted in her heart. The call was a wrong note in the peaceful melody of the night. An hour later, she was woken again. This time, it was not the phone. It was a sound from above, a single, violent bang on the roof, sharp and loud, as if a giant had dropped a heavy log. It was followed immediately by a strange, rolling, bumping noise that seemed to travel the length of the roof before fading into silence. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She listened, straining her ears against the familiar groans of the old house and the sighing of the wind. But there was nothing more, just the deep, rhythmic breathing of my father beside her. She convinced herself it was nothing, a branch falling, perhaps, or a trick of the wind. She lay back down and, eventually, drifted back into a fitful sleep. It was 30 minutes later, just after 1:30 a.m., that the smell came. It wasn't the comforting smell of wood smoke from the hearth. This was a different beast entirely. It was acrid and chemical, a thick, greasy odor that clawed at the back of the throat. It was the smell of things burning that were never meant to burn. It was the smell of destruction. The fire, they later determined, had started in my father's office. The small room where the fuse box was mounted, where the telephone line entered the house. The room where that strange, unsettling call had been answered. Chaos erupted. It was a frantic, primal scramble for life. My father, my mother, my two eldest brothers, John and George Jr., and my sister Marion, all managed to fight their way through the thickening smoke and out into the freezing night air. My father's first panicked shouts were for the children upstairs, in the attic bedrooms. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Their names were ripped from his throat, swallowed by the roar of the flames that were now beginning to consume the house with an unnatural speed. The nightmare that followed was a cascade of impossible failures, a series of coincidences so perfect in their cruelty they defied all logic. My father, his mind racing, sprinted to the side of the house where he always kept a heavy ladder propped, ready for any emergency. It wasn't there. It had vanished. A frantic search in the darkness revealed nothing. It was only later, in the cold light of day, that it was found, inexplicably, in an embankment 75 feet from the house. He screamed for my older brothers to help him with the trucks. His plan was to drive them close to the house, to climb atop them to reach the attic windows. But the trucks, both of which had been running perfectly the day before, were dead. The engines wouldn't turn over. They cranked and sputtered with a horrifying finality, refusing to yield their power. The water barrel, another line of defense against a farm fire, was frozen solid, a useless block of ice. Every avenue of rescue was cut off, as if by a deliberate, malevolent hand. By the time the fire department finally arrived, the house was no longer a house. It was a funeral pyre. Their arrival had been delayed, they explained, because the central telephone line to the town was down. The one firefighter, who knew how to operate the town's only fire truck, couldn't be reached. When he finally was, it was far too late. We stood there, a small, shattered huddle in the snow, and watched as our world turned to ash. The flames climbed into the black West Virginia sky, a terrible orange beacon that devoured every memory, every laugh, every piece of our lives. And somewhere inside that inferno, we believed, were 5 of our own. Asterisk, asterisk, the official investigation began on Christmas morning, a grotesque parody of the day it was supposed to be. The world was draped in a fresh blanket of snow, pristine and silent, but our world was a gaping, black wound in the landscape. The fire chief, a man named F.J. Morris, poked through the debris for a few hours. His search was, by all accounts, cursory. He walked through the still smoldering basement, declared it was too hot to do a thorough search, and left. The official story was already taking shape. A tragic accident, faulty wiring, a Christmas Eve that ended in unimaginable loss. For days, my family waited in a state of suspended animation, lodged with relatives in a haze of shock and disbelief. They expected a call. They expected news. They expected the grim discovery of what was left of my siblings, but the call never came. After 5 days of this agonizing silence, my father could bear it no longer. He took a bulldozer to the site himself, intending to clear the debris and turn the basement into a memorial garden. It was only then, as he began to push the blackened earth, that the full, chilling strangeness of the situation began to dawn. There was nothing. No bones, no teeth, not a single identifiable fragment of 5 human children. The coroner convened an inquest just days later. It was a swift, clinical affair. He issued 5 death certificates. The cause of death for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty was listed as fire or suffocation. When my father, his voice raw with grief, demanded to know how it was possible for 5 bodies to have vanished so completely, the coroner had a ready answer. The fire, he explained, had been intensely hot, creating its own kind of furnace effect. It was hot enough, he stated with unnerving certainty, to have completely cremated their bodies, leaving nothing but dust. My parents never believed it. Not for a second. The official explanation felt like a lie, a story too neat and simple to contain the horror of that night. For my mother, it was an insult to her children's very existence. She refused to let them be dismissed as dust. In the weeks that followed, she began a series of gruesome experiments in our yard. She would get animal bones from the butcher chicken carcasses, beef joints, a pig's head once, and she would build fires. She built them in barrels, trying to replicate the contained heat the coroner had described. She burned them for hours, until the flames died down to glowing embers. And every single time, when the ashes cooled, the bones remained, charred, brittle, but unmistakably there. She would hold them up for my father to see, her hands blackened with soot, her eyes burning, with a righteous fury. "Bones don't burn," she would say, her voice a low, dangerous thing. "They don't just disappear." Her grim proof was bolstered by whispers that began to surface in the town. A bus driver who had passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve came forward. He swore he'd seen people standing by the side of the road near our house, throwing what he described as balls of fire at the roof. His story matched the sound my mother had heard, the loud bang, the rolling noise. Another woman, who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, contacted my parents. She claimed to have seen my siblings on Christmas morning. She said a car with Florida license plates had pulled in, and 4 of the 5 children were in the back seat. She remembered them distinctly, she said, because they were with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction, and they seemed to be in a hurry. She said she had tried to be friendly to the children, but the adults had acted strangely, refusing to let them out of the car. The story of the strange phone call took on a new, sinister light, and the cut phone line, which had delayed the fire department, was confirmed by a telephone repairman. He told my father that the line hadn't been melted by the fire. It had been cut, cleanly, by someone who had climbed the utility pole 14 feet from the ground. Every piece of the puzzle pointed away from accident and toward a deliberate, orchestrated act. It suggested my siblings hadn't died in the fire at all. It suggested they had been taken. Then, months later, when the spring thaw had melted the last of the heavy snow, I was the one who found it. I was playing in the brush near where our house had been, a toddler exploring a world I couldn't understand. My hand closed around something small, hard, and cold. It was a dark green rubber object, shaped like a tiny pineapple. I brought it to my mother, who called for my father. He took one look at it, and his face went pale. He said it looked like a pineapple bomb, a type of handheld incendiary device, the kind used to start fires. This discovery solidified everything. It was tangible proof that the fire was no accident. It was arson. And if it was arson, then the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the cut phone line, they were all part of a plan. A plan to trap my family, to ensure the house burned to the ground, and to provide cover for an abduction. From that moment on, my parents' grief transformed. It was no longer the passive, mourning sorrow of a family who had lost their children to a tragic accident. It became an active, driving force. They were no longer victims. They were investigators. They hired a private detective, a man named C.C. Tinsley, who immediately uncovered a disturbing connection. He learned that the fire, Chief F.J. Morris, had a brother who was on the coroner's jury that had declared the children dead, and this brother had recently had his home foreclosed on, only to have it purchased for him by a man my father had publicly accused of being tied to the local Italian mafia, a man my father had argued with fiercely. The threads were beginning to connect, painting a picture of local corruption and a conspiracy of silence. My parents realized they were not just fighting a fire, they were fighting the town itself. Their search for their children had just begun, and they knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were utterly and completely alone in it. Asterisk, asterisk, for the rest of their lives, my parents searched. Their hope became a stubborn, relentless thing, a third parent in our fractured household. It dictated our finances, our conversations, our very existence. They poured every spare dollar into the search, traveling to follow up on flimsy leads, printing thousands of flyers, and pleading with law enforcement officials who had long since closed the case. They became known as the grieving parents, the ones who couldn't let go. But it wasn't that they couldn't let go. It was that they refused to. They were tethered to their missing children by a bond that no fire, no conspiracy, and no amount of time could ever burn through. In 1952, they erected a monument to that bond, on a grassy patch of land along Route 16, the main highway that sliced through our part of the state. They put up a billboard. It was huge, impossible to miss. Against a stark white background were the 5 black and white photographs of my siblings, their school pictures, their faces frozen in a time before the fire. Maurice, with his serious eyes, Martha, with her shy smile, Louis, with a cowlick that defied gravity, Jenny, with her bright, curious gaze, and little Betty, a cherub in a ruffled dress. Below their faces, in bold, black letters, was the story of the fire and the offer of a reward, first $5,000, then $10,000 for any information leading to their recovery. That billboard became a local landmark, a permanent fixture of the landscape and of our lives. For travelers, it was a momentary curiosity, a strange and tragic story to remark upon before driving on. For the people of Fayetteville, it was a constant, uncomfortable reminder. For my surviving siblings and me, it was a public declaration of our private sorrow. We grew up in its shadow. Every trip to town, every school bus ride, there they were. Our lost brothers and sisters, watching over the highway, their images fading and weathering with the seasons, just as our hopes did. My parents maintained it dutifully, repainting the letters when they chipped, replacing the photos when they yellowed. It was their vigil, their unwavering statement to the world, and to whoever took their children, that they would never, ever, stop looking. The years bled into one another. The 1940s became the 1950s, then the 1960s. I grew from a girl into a young woman, the story of my lost siblings woven into the very fabric of my identity. There were sightings, of course, dozens of them over the years. A woman in St. Louis who swore she saw Martha in a convent. A man in Texas who claimed to have had a drunken conversation with a man who boasted of kidnapping the Sauter children. My parents chased every lead, no matter how faint. Each one was a fresh surge of adrenaline, a frantic flurry of phone calls and letters, followed by the inevitable, crushing disappointment. Then, in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of a young man in his late 20s or early 30s. He had dark, curly hair, slicked back from his forehead, thick, dark eyebrows, and the same deep-set eyes and full lips as my brother Morris. The resemblance was more than striking. It was staggering. It was as if someone had taken a photograph of my brother and aged him 23 years. On the back of the photograph, a cryptic, handwritten message. Louis Sauter. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. It was a bombshell. My parents stared at the photograph for hours, their hands trembling. It was him. They were certain of it. The message was nonsensical, a jumble of words and numbers. But the face was Morris. Or was it Louis? The name on the back was Louis, but the face was Morris's. The confusion didn't matter. It was one of them. It was proof. They were alive. The hope that had been smoldering for 2 decades roared back to life, white-hot and all-consuming. They immediately hired another private investigator, a man from out of state, and sent him to Kentucky to track down the origin of the letter and the man in the photograph. He was confident, professional. He took their money, and they're desperate, hoping he went to Central City. He sent a few initial reports, confirming he had arrived, that he was beginning to ask questions, and then he vanished. Completely. He never contacted my parents again. He never returned. It was as if the town, or the mystery, had simply swallowed him whole. The disappearance of the investigator was the final, cruelest blow. It confirmed my parents' deepest fears, that they were not just searching for lost children, but were up against a powerful, shadowy force that could make people disappear. The photograph, which had been a beacon of hope, now felt like a taunt, a ghost sent to torment them. They are all gone now. My father passed away a year after the investigator vanished, a man worn down by a lifetime of fighting. My mother followed him a decade later, her heart finally giving out. She never took the billboard down. She never stopped talking about her lost children, as if they had just stepped out of the room. My surviving siblings, John, George, Jr., and Marion, lived out their lives, forever marked by that night. And now, they too are gone. I am the last one left. The last person on earth who holds the full story, this patchwork quilt of grief and mystery. I am an old woman now, and the house on Route 16 is long gone. The memorial garden my father planted now overgrown, but the billboard, or a newer version of it, still stands. A testament to a love that refused to die. I don't know if my brothers and sisters died in the fire, consumed by the flames, as the official story claims, or if they were taken in the night, stolen away to live other lives under other names. And that not knowing, that vast empty space where the truth should be, is its own kind of fire. It's not the hot, roaring inferno that took our house. It's a slow, quiet burn, one that has been smoldering inside me for a lifetime, leaving behind its own kind of ash. My name is Robin Keene. That's not my real name, of course. In a story like this, a story that breathes in the dust of forgotten files and whispers in the cold, dead air of a morgue, real names are a liability. They are anchors, and I have spent a lifetime trying to stay adrift from the wreckage of the past. To give you my real name would be to give you a map, and the place this story leads is somewhere no one should ever go. I knew the man the world calls the Somerton Man. I wish I could say I didn't. It would be easier to sleep at night. Easier to look at my own reflection without seeing the faint outline of a ghost. I didn't know him well, not in the way you know a friend or a brother. My knowledge of him was tangential, a connection forged by marriage and proximity, but it was a connection nonetheless. His name was Carl Webb, though he sometimes introduced himself as Charles, a small, almost pointless affectation that spoke volumes about the man he was to the world. He was a phantom. To me, he was my sister's husband. Carl was an electrical engineer by trade, a man who found comfort in the clean, logical flow of currents and the precise architecture of circuits. His mind was a place of schematics and order, yet his soul was a tangled mess of wires, spitting sparks in the dark. He was a quiet man, almost unnervingly so. He could sit in a bustling room and become part of the furniture. His stillness a vacuum that seemed to draw the life out of the air around him. But beneath that placid surface, there was a constant, humming tension. He wrote poetry, but not the kind you read on greeting cards. His verses were dark, fragmented things, filled with imagery of decay and the quiet desperation of a man watching the world from behind a pane of thick, soundproof glass. He wrote about the beauty in a rusty tin gear, the finality of a fallen leaf. He was a poet of endings, and he had a penchant for betting on horses. It wasn't a casual hobby. It was a compulsion, another system of logic he tried to impose on an illogical world. He didn't speak of wins or losses in terms of money, but in terms of patterns and predictions. It was an extension of his work, analyzing variables, calculating odds, searching for a hidden order in the thunder of hooves and the chaos of the track. It was a secret he kept tucked away, another locked room in the labyrinth of his mind. He was my sister Dorothy's husband. For a time, their marriage was, to put it mildly, a catastrophe. Dorothy was vibrant and full of life, a woman who laughed easily and loved fiercely. She saw in Carl a quiet depth, a mystery she thought she could solve. She mistook his silence for wisdom, his distance for a romantic melancholy. She was wrong. The reality was that Carl was incapable of letting anyone in. He was a closed circuit. Their home never felt like a home. It felt like a waiting room. The silences between them weren't peaceful. They were heavy, suffocating things, thick with unspoken resentments and Carl's impenetrable moods. I remember visiting them for Sunday dinner once. Dorothy would be fluttering around the kitchen, trying to fill the quiet with chatter, while Carl would sit in his armchair, staring out the window, his gaze fixed on something 1,000 miles away. He wouldn't be rude, not explicitly. He would answer direct questions with curt, precise answers, but he offered nothing of himself. He didn't live with her so much as haunt the house she occupied. The dark poetry, the gambling, the long, unexplained absence, it all wore her down, chipping away at her light until she was as gray and silent as he was. It was not a happy marriage. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution. The last time I saw Carl was in the autumn of 1948. Dorothy had finally left him. She had packed a single bag and walked away, unable to bear the weight of his emptiness any longer. I ran into him on a street corner in Adelaide. The air was crisp, smelling of coal smoke and the coming rain. He looked diminished. The quiet confidence he projected, the sense of a man in control of his own intricate world, was gone. He was adrift, his eyes scanning the faces of passersby, as if searching for an answer they couldn't possibly provide. He told me he was traveling, looking for work. He mentioned he might try to find Dorothy, a statement that sent a chill down my spine. There was a desperation in his voice I hadn't heard before, a frayed edge to his usual composure. We spoke for no more than 5 minutes, a stilted, awkward exchange on a busy sidewalk. I offered him a few pounds, which he refused. I told him to take care of himself. He just nodded, a strange, hollow look in his eyes, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I didn't think much of it at the time. Men like Carl were always coming and going, always on the periphery. Then, he vanished. Months later, the story broke. It started as a local curiosity, a small column in the paper. The body of a man found on Somerton Beach, propped against the seawall as if resting. He was smartly dressed in a suit and tie, his shoes impeccably polished, but there was no wallet, no identification, and, most bizarrely, all the labels had been meticulously cut from his clothing. The police were baffled. It was a perfect enigma. A man with no name, no past, who had simply appeared on the beach and ceased to be. The story grew, capturing the public's imagination. Who was this man? A spy? A jilted lover? The mystery deepened with each passing day. The police, in an attempt to identify him, made a plaster cast of his head and shoulders and published photographs in the national papers. I remember the morning I saw it. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the weak morning light filtering through the window, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. And there he was, on the front page. It wasn't a photograph of a face. It was a photograph of a plaster shell, an effigy. Yet, through the stark white of the cast, I saw him. The high cheekbones, the set of the jaw, the distinct shape of his ears. It was Carl. Thought a jolt went through me, so powerful it felt like an electric shock. The teacup rattled in its saucer. My blood ran cold. It was him. It was my sister's husband, the quiet engineer, the poet of decay. My first instinct was to pick up the telephone, to call the police, to give the ghost a name. But then, a second wave washed over me. Fear. Cold, rational fear. Carl was a complicated man. His life was a web of secrets I couldn't even begin to untangle. And what would it achieve? It would drag Dorothy back into the orbit of his darkness, a darkness she had fought so hard to escape. It would involve me, my family, in a mystery that the police themselves were treating with extreme caution. I folded the newspaper, my hands trembling slightly. I pushed it to the far side of the table. I said nothing. I told myself it was for the best, to protect my sister, to stay out of it. It was a choice made of fear and a misguided sense of protection, a choice that would plant a seed of guilt in my soul that would grow for the rest of my life. I had seen the ghost, and I had turned my back, leaving him to be a mystery to the world. I didn't know then that the mystery was only just beginning, and that it would find its way back to my door. My silence was a stone dropped into a still pond, and for a while, the surface remained unbroken. The world moved on. The Somerton man became a fixture of morbid folklore, a campfire story for a nation. His body, unclaimed and unidentified, was eventually buried in the West Terrace Cemetery. The service paid for by the South Australian Grandstand Bookmakers Association, a strange, almost poetic irony, given Carl's secret passion. An officer at the funeral read from the Rubaiyat, a final, fittingly enigmatic farewell. I followed the proceedings from a distance, a silent mourner hiding behind the pages of a newspaper. My guilt, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of my daily life. I told myself the story was over. But Carl, even in death, was a master of the unfinished sentence. His story was far from ended. Months after the body was found, the next piece of the puzzle surfaced. A brown suitcase, left at the Adelaide railway station cloakroom the day before the body was discovered. When it remained unclaimed for months, the station staff finally handed it over to the police. Inside, they found a collection of clothing, a dressing gown, slippers, pajamas, and various tools. including a stenciling brush of the kind used by officers on merchant ships. But it was the name on the clothes that made my blood freeze all over again. Several items were marked with the name T. Keen. My name is not Thomas, it's Robin, but my middle name is Thomas T. Keen. It was close enough to feel like a brand, seared into my skin. The police announcement hit me like a physical blow. I remember reading the article, my heart hammering against my ribs. Why? Why would he use my name? The police, in their official, dispassionate way, theorized it was a deliberate misdirection. They assumed the owner of the suitcase was trying to throw them off the scent, planting a false name to obscure his true identity. They were right, of course, but they couldn't possibly understand the chilling intimacy of it. This wasn't a random name plucked from the air. It was a message. It was Carl, reaching out from beyond the grave, pulling me into the mystery I had so desperately tried to avoid. Was it a final, bitter joke? A way of implicating the family of the wife who had left him? Or was it something else? A desperate, clumsy attempt to leave a trail, a breadcrumb, for the one person who might understand the convoluted pathways of his mind. I didn't know, and the not knowing was a form of torture. Every knock on the door made me jump. Every time a police car drove down my street, I felt a surge of panic. They would connect the dots, I thought. They would find me. They would ask questions I couldn't answer without revealing the truth about Carl, and in doing so, shattering my sister's fragile peace. But they never came. To them, T.I. Keen was just another dead end, a name with no face attached. To me, it was a ghost, rattling the handle of my front door. The true heart of the mystery, however, was yet to be revealed. It came in the form of a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper, found by the coroner during a final examination of the body. It had been concealed deep within a fob pocket, sewn into the man's trousers, a secret pocket for a secret message. The paper contained just 2 words, printed in an elegant, distinctive font. Tamam Shud. The phrase, as the experts quickly discovered, was Persian. It meant it is ended or it is finished. It was the final phrase from a collection of poems, called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The discovery electrified the investigation. This wasn't just a random death. It was a death signed with a literary flourish. It was pure Carl. The poet of endings had chosen his own epitaph. The police launched a nationwide appeal to find the specific copy of the book from which the scrap had been torn. Weeks later, a man came forward. He told the police that on the day after the body was found, he and his brother-in-law had been parked near Somerton Beach when they discovered a book tossed into the back of their unlocked car. It was a rare edition of the Rubaiyat. They hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but after seeing the appeal, they turned it over to the authorities. When the forensic team examined the book, they confirmed it. A tiny tear in the final page matched the Tamam Shud scrap perfectly. The book and the man were inextricably linked, but it was what they found inside the back cover of that book that transformed the case from a local mystery into a matter of national security. Written in faint pencil, almost invisible to the naked eye, were 2 things. The first was a telephone number. The second was what appeared to be a coded message. 5 lines of jumbled capital letters. The last line struck through. It looked like gibberish, a random assortment of characters. But its placement, its deliberate concealment, suggested it was anything but. The police, now suspecting espionage, handed the code over to the best minds in the country, naval intelligence. They were certain it was a spy's message, the key to a Cold War conspiracy that had ended with a silent execution on a quiet Australian beach. The phone number, at least, was a tangible lead. It belonged to a woman named Jessica Thompson, a nurse who lived on Mosley Street, just a short walk from Somerton Beach. When the police arrived at her door and showed her the plaster cast of the dead man's face, her reaction was, by all accounts, extreme. The detective in charge described her as completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. She was clearly shocked, horrified even. But then, she denied everything. She claimed she had no idea who the man was. She said she had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it as a gift to a soldier named Alfred Boxall during the war. It seemed like a breakthrough. The police located Boxall, who was very much alive, and more importantly, still had the copy of the Rubaiyat Jessica had given him, complete with her inscription. It was a dead end. The book found in the car was not Boxall's. Jessica Thompson's connection to the case remained a tantalizing but unproven possibility. She was lying. Her reaction to the cast proved that. But why? Who was she protecting? I read about the nurse, the code, the unlisted phone number. I saw the photograph of the jumbled letters in the newspaper. To the rest of the world, it was an impenetrable cipher, a glimpse into a shadowy world of spies and secret agents. Naval intelligence worked on it for months, applying every technique they knew. They found nothing. They declared it unsolvable. A random, meaningless scrawl. But I knew Carl. I knew his methodical mind, his obsession with patterns, his secret life at the racetrack. And as I stared at those 5 lines of letters, a different theory began to form in my mind. A theory born, not of espionage, but of desperation. I thought about his notebooks, filled not just with dark poetry, but with charts and calculations. I thought about his quiet fanaticism for the horses, spies, and governments. It felt too grand, too impersonal for Carl. His world was internal, his battles fought within the confines of his own skull. The police also noted something else about the body. The man had highly developed athletic calf muscles, like those of a ballet dancer. It was a strange detail that led them down another fruitless path, searching for connections to the world of dance. For me, it was just another piece of noise. But I did learn something about the nurse, Jessica Thompson. She had a son, a young boy named Robin, the same name as mine. It was probably a coincidence, but in the universe of Carl Webb, I was no longer sure that coincidences existed. Every detail felt like another thread in a web he was weaving around me, a web of names and books and secrets, pulling me closer to the truth I had tried so hard to bury. He had ended his story, but he had made me a character in it, and the final chapter was a riddle I was beginning to fear only I could solve. The world saw a spy. Naval intelligence, with all its resources and gravitas, saw a Cold War casualty, a man silenced before he could pass on his secrets. They looked at the 5 lines of jumbled letters and saw a sophisticated cipher, a key to a global conspiracy. They were professionals, trained to see the grand machinations of power and deceit. But they didn't know Carl Webb. I did, and when I looked at that code, I didn't see a spy. I saw a gambler placing his final bet. The idea rooted itself in my mind, a stubborn weed in the well-tended garden of official theories. It haunted me. I would lie awake at night. The strange sequence of letters projected onto the darkness of my ceiling. Argo Abobbed, MLIAOI, Tu Timpanet, MLIA, BOA, IAQC, ITM Sam Scab. To the cryptographers, it was noise. To me, it was starting to sound like a faint, desperate whisper. I knew about Carl's notebooks. Dorothy had complained about them, these thick ledgers he filled with his meticulous, spidery handwriting. She thought they were filled with his dark poetry, and many of them were. But others were different. They were filled with columns of names, numbers, and cryptic annotations. They were his betting books. His approach to gambling wasn't one of reckless abandon. It was an extension of his engineering mind. He was searching for a system, a hidden logic in the chaos of the racetrack. He tracked bloodlines, jockey histories, track conditions, and the phases of the moon. For all I knew, he believed that if he could just gather enough data, if he could just find the right formula, he could bend probability to his will. He wasn't just betting on horses. He was trying to solve the universe, one race at a time, and that's when I understood. That code wasn't for spies or governments. It wasn't meant to be deciphered by naval officers. I believe it was for his bookie. My theory is simple, so simple that the experts, in their search for complexity, would never have considered it. I don't believe those letters are a substitution cipher. I believe they are the first letters of the names of horses, an acrostic. It was a system he'd mentioned to me once, in a rare moment of unguarded conversation. A way of tracking a complex, multi-race, beta quadrella perhaps, or something even more elaborate. Why write it all out, he'd mused, when you can create a formula? Look at the second line, MLIAOI. Perhaps it meant my luck is all over, is it? Or the fourth, MLIABOAIAQC. My luck is a bit off. Am I a queen's counsel? It sounds like nonsense, but Carl's poetry was full of these strange, stilted phrases. It's more likely, I think, that they were simply the first letters of the horses' names. Might and Power, Letzelope, Tulloch, Farlap. The names themselves don't matter. The point is the system. It was a private language, a shorthand, between him and his bookmaker, or perhaps just for himself. A final, desperate gamble against oblivion. He wasn't a spy being hunted by an enemy state. He was a broken man, a man who wrote poems about death, who had lost his wife, the one vibrant thing in his gray, ordered world and was playing out the last hand he was dealt. He was adrift, just as he'd told me on that street corner. He had traveled to perhaps following a lead on Dorothy, perhaps drawn to the nurse, Jessica Thompson, a woman from a past none of us knew about. Maybe she was an old flame, a final port in a storm. Her violent reaction to his plaster face, her immediate lie about not knowing Hemet, was the reaction of a woman terrified of having her life appended, of having a ghost from her past drag her into a public scandal. She was protecting herself, her family, her son, the son named Robin, a strange, haunting echo of my own name. Another thread in Carl's web. I believe he went to Somerton for a final reckoning, not with a foreign power, but with himself. He placed his bet, a complex, all-or-nothing wager, and then he waited. He went to the beach, sat against the seawall, and waited for the results. The finality of Tamam Shud wasn't just a poetic flourish. It was the statement of a man who had placed his entire future on the turn of a card, or in his case, the outcome of a series of horse races. It is ended. Win or lose, his old life was over. If he won, perhaps he believed he could start again. He would have money, a means to disappear, and build a new life. Maybe even win Dorothy back. If he lost, he had his escape planned. The poison, fast-acting and untraceable. A quiet and tidy exit befitting an engineer. The labels cut from his clothes, the wallet discarded, was a systematic erasure of self. He would become a phantom, a puzzle, with no solution. He would not be Carl Webb, the failed husband, the melancholic poet. He would be the Somerton man, an enigma. It was his last, greatest act of obfuscation. The crossed-out line in the code. Perhaps it was a mistake, a horse scratched from a race, a change in the bet. It's the detail that, to me, makes it feel most real. A spy's code would be perfect. A gambler's last-minute bet is full of human error. Naval intelligence couldn't crack it because they were trying to read a state secret, and all they had was a betting slip. They were looking for a key to unlock a war, but it was just a key to a man's despair. The world has spent decades searching for a grand conspiracy, but I believe the truth is smaller, sadder, and infinitely more human. He was never a spy. He was a poet who fell in love with endings, and he orchestrated his own to be the most baffling of all. I never told Dorothy my theory. She rebuilt her life, found a measure of peace, and I would not be the one to drag her back into the shadow of the man who almost extinguished her light. I have carried this knowledge alone, a silent custodian of a secret that the world is still trying to solve. The mystery of the Somerton man is not about who killed him. It's about the fact that he chose to die in a way that would make his life, and his death, a permanent question mark. He erased himself, leaving behind only a scrap of poetry and a riddle that was never meant to be understood by the world. It was meant for a bookie who never collected, and perhaps for the brother-in-law who saw the ghost and chose to say nothing.